guys, just wanted to show my appreciation and say thanks for the support. I really want to grow this channel, so any support is greatly appreciated. So please drop a like and a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. May 22nd, 2019, Darndale, North Dublin. 4 p.m, a clear afternoon. Jordan Davis, 22, strolls down a laneway off Marigold Road, pushing a pram with his 4-month-old son. It's a mundane, tender scene until a figure on a bicycle appears. The cyclist is clad in black, face shrouded by a hood and balaclava. He pulls a handgun. Shots explode in the quiet suburban air. Residents later recall hearing a rapid series of cracks near Our Lady Immaculate School. Davis is hit 3 times, chest, arm, head. He collapses beside the pram. The gunman pedals away fast on a red mountain bike, vanishing around a corner. In the chaos, a child playing nearby freezes in shock. Within seconds, Jordan Davis lies dying on the pavement, his infant son wailing in the pram. Neighbors race out of their homes at the sound of screams. It's broad daylight in a quiet Dublin suburb, yet a young father has just been executed. This brazen murder wasn't an isolated act. It was the second gangland shooting in less than 18 hours. Part of a spiraling feud tearing through the Coolock area of Dublin. Less than a day earlier, Jordan's close friend had been found dead beside a burning car. The 2 murders would plunge North Dublin into one of its bloodiest underworld conflicts. To understand how it came to this, we need to rewind to where the feud began, with a drug debt paid in blood. It started with a debt. January 17, 2019, Swords, North County, Dublin. Zach Parker, 23, pulls his car out of the parking lot of a local gym on Applewood Close. It's evening. Parker has just finished a workout. As he turns onto the road, a gunman steps from the shadows and opens fire on the vehicle. Bullets rip through the driver's side window. Parker is hit multiple times. His car veers and stops, windshield spider-webbed with bullet holes. His passenger, a friend, is wounded but alive. Zach Parker dies slumped in the driver's seat. Garda arrive to a grim scene, shell casings on asphalt, shattered glass, a young man's lifeless body. Parker was known to them, a low-level drug dealer with a taste for the high life. He had prior convictions for cocaine dealing. In Dublin's underworld, the 23-year-old Parker was considered an up-and-coming figure on the north side drug scene. He drove flashy cars and wore designer clothes, but that lifestyle was built on dangerous connections and debts. Word on the street was that Parker owed a substantial sum, nearly $200,000, to his suppliers, a gang tied to the Kinahan cartel. He'd taken a package of drugs on credit, and Garda had seized it in a raid, leaving Zach unable to repay the gang. The group he was indebted to was nicknamed the Gucci Gang, a clique of young gangsters known for their love of luxury brands and gaudy displays of wealth. They were led by a notorious fingerless gang boss called Mr. Flashy. For Zach Parker, failing to pay that debt was a death sentence. Investigators later suspected that Parker's own associates may have set him up to appease higher-ups in the cartel. In the cutthroat world of Dublin drug trade, loyalty is fickle. On that cold night in Swords, someone seemingly betrayed the young dealer. A friend in the passenger seat, a burst of gunfire, and Parker was gone. His murder sent shockwaves through the gangs of Coolock and beyond. One of those most shaken was Parker's close friend, Sean Little. Little was only 22, but already knee-deep in the drug business himself. He had grown up in Coolock and aligned with the Gucci Gang hierarchy. In fact, Sean Little was an associate of Mr. Flashy. He moved in the same circles as Parker, rubbing shoulders with Kinahan cartel-linked figures. Parker wasn't just a business partner, Sean Little's friend. And now he was dead. After Parker's assassination, Sean Little was a man on edge. Those close to him say the young gangster was livid and heartbroken. Parker had been like a brother. Rumors swirled that Little wanted revenge, that he vowed to get the rats who killed Zach. In the underworld, even whispering about payback can put a target on your back. The Gucci Gang leaders got wind that Little might seek vengeance for his friend. For 4 months, tensions simmered. Underneath the outward calm, betrayals were brewing. Unbeknownst to Little, some of the men he considered allies were already plotting his demise. just as they had Zach's. One was an older associate in their circle, Hamid Sanambar, a 41-year-old Iranian-born criminal. Sanambar had a reputation as a hired gun, someone who did dirty work for various gangs. He was friendly with Little, but that friendship may have been a cover. Garda intelligence later suggested that Sanambar secretly agreed to murder Sean Little for a fee. The order likely came from the Fingless gang, who feared Little's loyalty had wavered after Parker's death. May 21, 2019, near Balbriggan, North Cumber, Dublin. Late night, Sean Little drives a black Opel Insignia along a rural backroad off the M1 motorway. It's a desolate spot called Rowan's Little, not far from the city but eerily quiet at midnight. Little believes he's headed to a meeting, perhaps with a trusted friend, to discuss the next move. Instead, he's heading into an ambush. What happens next is brutal. Sometime before 11:30 p.m., gunfire erupts in the darkness. Locals later report hearing a series of loud cracks echoing across the fields. Sean Little shot multiple times in the head and upper body. His killers drag him out of the Insignia and dump him by the roadside. Then they torch the car. At 11:20 p.m., Dublin Fire Brigade responds to calls of a vehicle on fire near Junction 5 of the M1. They arrive to find the Opel engulfed in flames. As firefighters douse the blaze, a chilling sight emerges in the flicker of blue lights. A young man's body lying on the ground, illuminated by the glow of the burning car. It's Sean Little. He has been executed, his corpse left next to the flaming wreck. A grim gangland message. The double cross was complete. The very people Little once allied with had eliminated him. Investigators suspect Hamid Sanambar and at least one other accomplice lured Little out under false pretenses and shot him at close range. One shot to the head, an efficient kill. They then burned his car, perhaps to destroy evidence or simply to sow dread. News of Sean Little's murder spread fast through Coolock. He was the second young man from the area killed in less than 6 months. The community reeled, 2 local 22-year-olds, both with known drug ties, now slain. And it wasn't over. The worst was yet to come, within hours. May 22, 2019, just 18 hours later. In the early afternoon, even before Sean Little's family can process the news, Jordan Davis learns that his friend Shah is dead. Jordan is also 22, from Coolock, a small-time dealer and new father. He and Little were pals. They ran in the same crew. Grieving and angry, Jordan posts a tribute on Facebook around 3:45 p.m. A photo of himself and Sean Little, together with the caption, "Rest in paradise, you were a gent." It's a public show of loyalty and sorrow, but it may have also been a dangerous signal to those behind Little's killing. Less than an hour later, Jordan Davis is out walking in Darndale, a neighboring estate. He pushes his baby son's pram down a familiar pedestrian shortcut, a narrow laneway beside Our Lady Immaculate National School. Suddenly, a lone cyclist approaches from behind, steadily closing in. Some witnesses later recall the bike was a distinctive orange mountain bike. The rider dismounts swiftly, pulls out a 9mm pistol, and unleashes a volley of shots at Jordan. Jordan Davis has no time to react. Bullets strike him in the back and torso. One round tears into his head, killing him instantly. The stroller rolls a short distance before bumping to a stop as Jordan collapses. The killer hops back on the bike and pedals off at top speed, disappearing into the warren of streets. It's a clean getaway in broad daylight. Chaos erupts in the laneway. A baby crying hysterically, bystanders rushing to help, calling emergency services. Paramedics and Garda swarm the scene within minutes, but there is little they can do. Jordan is pronounced dead at the scene, lying on the ground just yards from the school gates, a bright red bloodstain on the concrete. His infant son, miraculously unhurt, is scooped up by a horrified neighbor. Dublin's police now have 2 homicide investigations on their hands, 2 friends murdered less than a day apart. Officially, they urge caution. "We're not making a connection at this point in time," one Garda superintendent tells the media that evening. But everyone knows these killings are linked. The Underworld feud that began with Zach Parker's death is accelerating. Young men are being cut down one after another in a cycle of revenge. Jordan's execution was particularly chilling for its brazenness. A father shot dead while pushing a pram. It shocked even veteran crime reporters. The message was clear. Nobody, not even a new dad on a midday stroll, was safe from the reach of these gangs. Jordan had allegedly crossed someone, and he likely knew it. In fact, evidence later emerged that Davis had been threatened. Only weeks before, a rival dealer warned him, "I'm on your case, mate," and reportedly appeared on a gang tick list with a huge debt next to it. Whether it was his unpaid bills or simply his loyalty to Sean Little, Jordan was marked for death. His Facebook tribute to his fallen friend may have only sealed his fate, showing his enemies he hadn't backed down. With Jordan Davis's murder, the feud had reached a fever pitch. Two high-profile shootings in less than a day put Coolock and Darndale on edge. Armed Garda patrols flooded the north side. The media dubbed it the Coolock feud, a deadly tit-for-tat conflict playing out in the suburbs of Dublin. And though the killings paused in the days immediately after, the bloodletting was not finished. 1 week later came a twist that reads like a movie script. Hamid Sanambar, the 41-year-old suspected triggerman in Sean Little killing, decided to show his face. On May 28, 2019, Sanambar attended the wake for Sean Little at the Little family home on Kilbarron Avenue, Coolock. Perhaps he thought no one suspected him. Perhaps, in the paranoid code of Gangland, he wanted to see who was whispering about him. What he didn't know was that he was now a marked man. That afternoon, mourners milled in and around the Little residence, paying respects to Sean Little's grieving parents. Sanambar arrived to offer condolences, blending in among the crowd of friends and family. But vengeance was in the air. Some of Little's associates strongly suspected Hamid Sanambar had double-crossed his pal. They believed this Iranian enforcer was the one who pulled the trigger on Sean Little, all while pretending to be a friend. For them, Sanambar's brazen appearance at the wake was an insult and an opportunity. At around 3:30 p.m., as Hamid Sanambar stood in the front garden of the Little home, chaos erupted. A car screeched to a halt outside, a silver Toyota Avensis. 3 men jumped out, faces covered by balaclavas, guns drawn. Shouts of alarm rang out, but it was too late. The gunman opened fire on Sanambar right there in the driveway. Multiple shots hit him at close range. Panicked mourners dove for cover behind walls and hedges. In the span of seconds, the Iranian hitman collapsed to the ground, blood pooling on the concrete path where just days before crowds had gathered after Sean Little's murder. The assassins then sprinted back to their getaway car and sped off, tires screeching, leaving Hamid Sanambar dying at the scene. By the time Garda and paramedics arrived, the 41-year-old was beyond saving. Sanambar was pronounced dead in the same garden where he had been shaking hands moments earlier. He'd been shot multiple times, a swift execution. The hitman had himself been hit. In Gangland law, it was almost poetic. The betrayer dispatched at the victim's own wake. Sanambar's killing was retaliatory justice in the eyes of Sean Little's crew. Unofficially, the word was that Little's father and friends had arranged the hit. Whether or not Stephen Little, Sean's father, was directly involved is unclear. But Garda sources feared that those close to Sean had orchestrated Hamid's demise. In doing so, they painted a new target on their backs. The cycle of vendetta was spinning even faster now. Every act of retribution invited another. Investigators later pieced together Sanambar's background. He was a known gun for hire, linked to multiple gangs, and even photographed alongside major cartel figures. He had arrived in Ireland years ago seeking asylum and stayed to build a criminal career. Now he lay dead, becoming the 4th murder victim in this feud since January. The feud was now roaring, 4 men slain in just over 4 months. Zach Parker, Sean Little, Jordan Davis, and Hamid Sanambar. Each killing was connected by a murky web of debt, betrayal, and reprisal. North Dublin hadn't seen carnage like this in years. And yet, unbelievably, there was still more blood to be spilled in 2019. By late 2019, the Coolock feud had fractured into a complex web of grudges. What began as one gang's internal purge now involved splinter groups and allies of allies. The violence was no longer neatly one side versus another, it had become a free-for-all of shaky loyalties. The murder of one young man in particular underscored just how chaotic the feud had become. November 24, 2019, Clonshaw Avenue, Coolock. Dusk is falling on a quiet Sunday. Owen "Fishy" Boylan, a 22-year-old local postman and small-time cocaine dealer, is gardening outside his home. Despite the cool weather, Owen is outside in his own front yard, perhaps believing danger has finally passed. He was friends with Zach Parker and part of that social circle, but months have gone by since the Bloody May shootings. Maybe he feels safe enough to let his guard down. If so, it's a fatal mistake. Around 5:15 p.m., a car pulls up and a gunman leaps out. Neighbors hear shouting, then gunshots. Boylan tries to flee through his garden, but he's caught out in the open. Bullets tear into him before he can reach cover. Within moments, Fishy Boylan lies bleeding to death among the hedges of his own yard. The shooter jumps back into the waiting vehicle, and they roar away into the evening traffic. Boylan's murder is yet another shock for Coolock. He becomes the fifth young man killed as part of this feud in 2019. Garda had actually warned Boylan months earlier that his life was in danger. He'd even survived a previous attempt on his life, but Ian didn't leave the area or go into hiding. He stayed in Coolock, and it cost him. The exact motive for his killing remains uncertain. In the tangled underworld gossip, there are several theories. Some say Boylan was still seeking revenge for his friend Zach Parker's death, and the gang behind Parker's murder decided to silence Fishy before he could strike. Others whisper that Boylan knew too much about who set up Sean Little, or may even have been involved in Hamid Sanambar's assassination. If he helped kill the hitman, Mr. Flashy's gang would want him gone. Another theory: Boylan had made careless comments on Facebook about Sean Little's murder. Perhaps he gloated or pointed fingers publicly. That kind of talk can be lethal. It might have offended the wrong people, painting a bullseye on him. Whatever the reason, by the end of 2019, the Coolock feud had claimed 5 lives in rapid succession. The neighborhood's criminal landscape was littered with bodies of former friends and allies. A vacuum of power had formed. With so many key players dead, various factions scrambled to fill the void and control the lucrative drug trade in North Dublin. The feud that started over a single debt had now spiraled into a multi-sided turf war. As the feud's body count rose, law enforcement intensified its crackdown. The Garda Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau had been surveilling many of these gang members for months. Their goal was to prevent the next killing if they could. And indeed, they managed to intervene just as another hit was about to happen. On September 14, 2019, 2 men were driving through Dublin's north side when a fleet of unmarked Garda cars boxed them in. Officers armed with automatic weapons swarmed the vehicle and ordered the occupants out. They arrested 47-year-old Stephen Little, the father of the late Sean Little, and Edward McDonnell, 25, a known associate from Wexford. In the car, Garda found a chilling arsenal: a loaded semi-automatic pistol, 2 black balaclavas, gloves, 2 baseball bats, a can of petrol, and a long-handled lighter. It was a Gangland hit kit, complete with tools to kill and then torch evidence. Under questioning, an enraged Stephen Little practically confessed his intent. He told the officers, "Had you given me another hour, I would have killed the bastard that killed him." The him in that sentence was his son, Sean. Stephen had become a vigilante father, hunting the people he believed murdered Sean. He was poised to exact his own revenge when the Garda's timely intervention foiled the plan. Little's fury was palpable. He also lamented to police, "I lost my marriage and my son." Decades of being involved in crime had culminated in personal tragedy and a thirst for blood. Both Stephen Little and Edward McDonnell were subsequently brought before the Special Criminal Court, Ireland's non-jury court for organised crime. They pleaded guilty to possession of a firearm with intent. The judge, noting that their arrest prevented another murder, handed down prison terms: 6 years for Stephen, 9 for McDonnell. The streets had been spared one more assassination, at least for that night. Meanwhile, the Garda investigation into the earlier murders continued relentlessly. Breakthroughs came in 2020 and 2021. In the Jordan Davis case, detectives had recovered CCTV footage of the cyclist assassin and traced his movements. They homed in on a suspect, Wayne Cooney, a 31-year-old gunman from Talot. Cooney had been circling Jordan for days before the hit, like a predator stalking prey. At trial, witnesses testified that Cooney was the man in the balaclava who pulled the trigger. In July 2022, a jury found Wayne Cooney guilty of Jordan Davis's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. At sentencing, the judge called Cooney an extremely dangerous individual for carrying out such a callous daylight slaying. Cooney's girlfriend, who had helped him escape and hide after the shooting, was also convicted for assisting an offender. Justice caught up with the bicycle hitman. The Hamid Sanambar murder remained more elusive. Garda suspected from the start that it was Little's associates who killed Hamid, but identifying them took time. Eventually, in 2024, nearly 5 years later, an Irish suspect was arrested in Spain on a European warrant for Sanambar's killing. This man, in his 30s, was nabbed on the Costa del Sol for an unrelated minor incident. Spanish police discovered he was wanted back in Ireland. He's now awaiting extradition for trial. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they are turning even for the triggermen of that payback hit at Sean Little's wake. Mid-2020, the intense cycle of shootings had slowed. Still, violence flared up occasionally. In May 2020, almost 1 year to the date of Little's death, a man in his 30s with ties to the feud was shot in the legs on Cromcastle Drive, Coolock. He survived, but the attack showed that tit-for-tat strikes were still a threat. Garda patrolled hard, determined not to let another summer of bloodshed erupt. What started as a dispute over drug money evolved into an all-out war on Dublin's north side. Over the course of 2019, the Coolock feud left 5 young men dead and countless others in fear. Friends turned enemies hunted each other through suburban streets. The killings were marked by treachery and brutality. A gangster betrayed by a confidant, a father executed beside his baby's pram, a hitman slain at a wake. These are scenes that sound like something out of a Gangland thriller, yet for the residents of Coolock and Darndale, it was a terrifying reality. The feud also laid bare a generational shift in Irish organised crime. Many of those involved were barely in their 20s, foot soldiers of a new breed stepping into a power vacuum left by older crime bosses. As police cracked down on the infamous Hutch-Kinahan feud, which raged in the mid-2010s, a void opened in the drug markets. Ambitious youngsters like Zach Parker and Sean Little rushed to fill it, eager for a slice of the profits and notoriety. They flaunted cash, designer clothes, and fast cars on social media, earning nicknames like the Gucci Gang. But as Assistant Commissioner Pat Leahy warned amid the violence, low-level dealing is enough to have your life taken at a young age. He was right. These lads were playing a high-stakes game, and most didn't live to see 25. Today, the gunfire in Coolock has subsided, but the scars remain. The major players are dead or behind bars. Mr. Flashy, the flamboyant gang boss at the feud's epicenter, remains a free man, though his name is forever tied to the blood spilled in 2019. He and his outfit reportedly moved on to other battles and rivalries in Dublin's Underworld. The neighborhood that was a war zone for a grim few months has returned to a tense normalcy. Families who lost sons, brothers and fathers are left with only memories and gravesites. Some truth did emerge through court trials. We know who pulled the trigger on Jordan Davis and likely who betrayed Sean Little. But many questions linger. Who exactly ordered each hit? Which murders were officially connected, and which were personal scores settled under the feud's chaos? Was Zach Parker truly set up by his own team, and if so, who gave that order? What deals were made in whispered phone calls and shadowy meetings that we'll never hear about? In the secretive world of Gangland Dublin, the truth remains buried beneath layers of fear and silence. Those who know the full story either won't talk, or they're already in the ground. The Coolock feuds have passed into Dublin crime law, a cautionary tale of betrayal, greed and vengeance. In just a few violent months, a small pocket of North Dublin saw a cascade of murder. Friends turned foes, alliances shattered, families destroyed. Each killing led to the next in a grim, inexorable chain. And at the heart of it all was a simple, deadly arithmetic of the drug trade. Owe money, pay with your life, lose trust, lose everything. As of today, Coolock's streets are quieter, but the ghosts of 2019 still haunt them. The young men who died, Zach, Sean, Jordan, Ian, have been reduced to headlines and statistics in Ireland's ongoing battle with gang crime. Their associates either met similar fates or carry on elsewhere, looking over their shoulders. The cycle of retaliation has ground to a halt for now, but the underlying conditions remain. The drug business is still lucrative, the players still willing to kill for a cut. In the end, the Kulak feud offers a stark lesson. In this world, loyalty is fragile and life is cheap. A friend one day can be an enemy the next. And as long as that truth holds, the peace is tenuous. For the residents of Kulak, there is relief that the feud's carnage has ended. Yet there's also an uneasy knowledge that in the shadows of Dublin's Gangland, another feud could ignite at any time. All it takes is a single spark, a single betrayal. Final lines. In a North Dublin community that still bears the wounds of 2019, the memories of the Kulak feud serve as both a warning and a tragedy. It began with a burning desire for money and ended with burning cars and bleeding streets. The feud consumed itself, leaving behind silence where gunshots once rang. But beneath that silence, the underworld grumbles on. The feud's survivors, the next generation of gangsters, and the fearful neighbors all wonder the same thing. When will the cycle begin anew? Only time will tell, and until then, the full truth of the Kulak feud remains locked away in hardened hearts and unspeaking graves. It was just past midnight when the hum of the city faded and the streets slipped into stillness. On a warm summer night in West Dublin, 40-year-old Mikey Farrelly was walking home from a family gathering, laughing earlier that evening, now alone with only the sound of his footsteps on pavement. Then came the screech. A stolen Hyundai Kona, engine howling, lights off, came flying down the residential road, cutting corners like it was a racetrack. Witnesses later said it was moving so fast it didn't even look real. The car didn't slow, it didn't stop. It struck Mikey at full speed. The impact threw him across the road. Paramedics would later say it was a miracle the car didn't plow into a house. But there was no time for miracles that night. The vehicle sped off. No brakes, no hesitation, just the fading roar of teenage chaos disappearing into the darkness. Mikey lay in the road, broken, lifeless. His family didn't get a phone call, they got a knock, and then silence. The killers didn't wear ski masks, they didn't need weapons. All they needed was a stolen car and zero regard for human life. The Farrelly family was left shattered, a father of 3, dead, a mother widowed, children fatherless. No goodbyes, no last words, just questions and rage. Who were they? And how could a pack of teenagers become a moving weapon? Garda quickly traced the car, already burned out in a field outside the city. It had been hotwired earlier that night during a spree of break-ins across Meath. The prime suspects, a network of joyriders and burglars under 18 known on the streets, and now across Ireland as the Lucky Dip Gang. For Mikey's family, the story ended that night. For Ireland, it was just beginning. The reckless teens behind the wheel didn't just take a life, they exposed a system that had lost control. Released on bail, ignoring curfews, documenting their chaos on TikTok for clout. This wasn't a one-off, this was part of a pattern. And now a man was dead. This is the world the Lucky Dip Gang built, and this is how it begins. The Lucky Dip moniker came from the gang's unpredictable tactics. Garda explained that members randomly pick a location on maps, then utilize the motorway network to travel to the location, often in stolen cars at high speed. In other words, they roll the dice. Choose a suburb, descend on it, and smash or grab anything in sight. Over 18 months, this juvenile network stole cars and burgled homes nightly, not for profit, but for kicks. As one police source told independent reporters, they've been pinching vehicles almost every night, using them mainly for high-speed joyrides rather than resale. In response, Garda have officially branded Lucky Dip an organized crime group, revealing an unprecedented scale. A recent Irish independent investigation found over 60 young people now linked to hundreds of thefts across Leinster. Even 15-year-olds are named as prolific offenders. In interviews, senior officers admit the group has grown in size, by recruiting like-minded youths online and flaunting clips of their stunts. TikTok is their platform of choice. Once a few friends started joyriding, others quickly piled on. Now many of these youths grew up together in working-class Dublin suburbs, the average age barely 15. They don't knock on doors, they don't need blueprints, and they never stay long. The Lucky Dip gang's strategy is as chaotic as it is efficient. Pick a target, strike fast, vanish faster. It starts with a screen. On any given night, one of the crew will open Google Maps on a burner phone. They'll scroll across the country like it's a menu. No pattern, no motive, just a digital spin of the wheel. Navan, Newbridge, Carlow, sometimes as far as Tullamore. Once a town is picked, they pile into a stolen car and hit the motorways, blasting down the M50 or M1 like ghosts. Police call it the rolling crime wave. The gang calls it a night out. The hit happens quickly. They don't care about alarms or barking dogs. They know they've got a window, 5, maybe 10 minutes before anyone reacts. One acts as the lookout, 2 head for driveways, gloves on, hoods up. They scan for keyless entry systems. Those are the jackpots. With the right relay device, they can spoof a signal and unlock your car from the street. If that fails, they go old school, smash the side window, pop the bonnet, get in and drive. Silence is irrelevant. Speed is king. If a house looks promising, they go inside. They're not searching for jewelry or heirlooms. What they want are car keys, laptops, game consoles, cash if they're lucky, but mostly it's the vehicles. They steal for status. The more dangerous the ride, the higher the street cred. One Garda source told us, it's like a leaderboard. The bolder the car, the bigger the rep. And they don't hide it. The Lucky Dip kids film themselves mid-crime, GoPros on their heads, phones taped to dashboards. They chase that viral thrill. Every stolen moment becomes content. A joyride becomes a montage. A burglary becomes a highlight reel. They drive like they're in a video game. In one clip, a teenager laughs as his stolen BMW flies through a roundabout. In another, a Snapchat overlay reads, "Woke up, chose carnage," as 2 16-year-olds barrel through a Garda checkpoint. But what happens when the police give chase? They bolt. Garda pursuit protocols often mean officers have to fall back to avoid endangering the public. Lucky Dip knows this. They'll weave through estates, cut across greenways, even go the wrong way on the M50. They don't fear crashing. In fact, it's part of the appeal. We're talking about children, some just 14, ripping through cities in stolen vehicles, grinning into their phones while driving 160 kilometers an hour. Sometimes it ends with a chase, sometimes with a fire. When they're done, they torch the vehicle, wipe prints, kill evidence, in fields, industrial parks, even in residential areas. The smell of melted plastic has become the calling card of a night out with Lucky Dip. There's no finesse, no grand plan, just chaos in motion. What makes them dangerous isn't just the crime, it's the unpredictability. One night it's burglary, the next a reckless high-speed chase. Every time they pick a new town, it's a roulette wheel with lives at stake. Their operation is mobile, fast, and largely untraceable, until someone gets caught, or someone dies. In this system, they don't run rackets, they run on adrenaline. It begins with a stolen car, it ends with mayhem. Across Dublin and the commuter belt, police scanners light up the moment Lucky Dip rolls into gear. These aren't subtle getaways, they're full-throttle declarations of defiance, loud, dangerous, and entirely deliberate. The Garda call them rolling threats, high-speed, high-risk pursuits through tightly packed estates, tires screeching, engines revving to redline, and bystanders diving out of the way. In just one weekend over Easter 2024, 9 separate chases were triggered across Leinster. 9 stolen cars, dozens of officers, a blur of terror ripping through otherwise quiet towns. Sometimes they taunt police with messages posted minutes after the crime. Catch us if you can. One video shows a stolen BMW spinning through a roundabout, another swerves around a Stinger deployment, barely missing the spike strip. These aren't just joyrides, they're moving weapons. Wrong way down the M50, twice. Motorists watched in disbelief as headlights came at them head-on. Garda ordered traffic to halt. It was a miracle no one died. The car, burned in a field outside Ashburn hours later. And it's not just speed, it's strategy. They know pursuit limits. They know the Garda can't endanger civilians during a chase, so they exploit it, cut through estates, ram checkpoints, even switch cars mid-chase. It's fast, unpredictable urban warfare, and every time they outrun the law, their myth grows stronger. Kids, some barely old enough for a learner's permit, treating 150 km/h getaways like a game of tag. Except when they lose, people bleed. Police call them ghosts in the suburbs. By the time a chase makes the news, the gang's already home, phones in hand, editing clips for TikTok. Every pursuit becomes content, every narrow escape a highlight. In the comments, laughing emojis, flames, W-mans from anonymous profiles. One video, posted the same night as a car chase through Swords, got over 40,000 views before it was pulled. This is the new breed of street crime, mobile, viral, and fueled by adrenaline. They're not stealing for resale. They're stealing for the story. When Garda do catch up, it's ugly. One lucky dip car was rammed into a ditch by a patrol unit near Kells. The teenagers inside tried to flee on foot. One fractured his leg in the jump. Another was tasered on a school field. They weren't carrying money. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying phones. All they cared about was whether the footage survived the crash. The ending's always the same. When the ride's over, they torch the evidence. Molotovs, petrol-soaked seats. The fire wipes fingerprints, blood, and any trace of the night's destruction. But not the damage. That lingers. For Garda, every pursuit is a coin toss. Back off and they get away. Give chase and someone could die. There's no safe way to stop a 17-year-old doing 140 in a stolen SUV, live streaming to 200 followers. And in the chaos, the gang isn't just risking lives, they're declaring war on order. The Lucky Dip crew doesn't shy away from publicity. On social media, they boast nightly prizes of thefts and chases. Garda even found sinister graffiti in Ballyfermot, tagging 2 local officers by name. One wall read, "This is my city," alongside a police badge. Videos on TikTok show hooded teens laughing with flashlights as they empty glove compartments or dance on bonnets. Police confirm that sharing these clips has helped the gang forge links with other like-minded young car thieves, swelling their ranks. The streets and the internet blur. Juvenile wrongdoers roam rooftops and dark alleys, while at the same time live streaming to an audience of peers. Neighbors describe spotting graffiti and immediately warning local Garda stations. Residents now share how to spot a Lucky Dip poster on WhatsApp groups, while sleuths monitor TikTok hashtags hoping to catch a glimpse of the next planned hit. It's a modern crime phenomenon. Every bold act is evidence left behind in pixels or on walls. The bail system means nothing to these kids, an investigator complained. Courts repeatedly remand Lucky Dip suspects, only to have them back on the streets weeks later, curfew and all. Much of the problem is systemic. Ireland has one children's detention centre, and it's already bursting. Independent reporting found several juvenile gang members remain out on bail simply because there's no room to hold them. Even when detained, these young offenders face harsh limits. A judge can only hold them for a short period under new criminal legislation. Garda statistics sound the alarm. In mid-2025, the Irish Independent noted Garda had identified 60-plus youth suspects, but could only prosecute a handful. 3 key members, each around 18, are finally in custody on car theft charges. Others flout bail conditions nightly, wearing scrambler bikes under curfew or driving off to hit a burglary. One source told Sunday World that several key members are ignoring their curfews completely. A Garda press officer confessed on background that catch and release has become routine. Officers might plan an arrest raid, only to find suspects still on bail. Beyond bail, even the prisons and jails are at capacity. Garda and prison officials have warned that adult facilities will soon struggle to handle any juvenile uptick. The dire situation has prompted calls for alternatives. The Justice Minister has fast-tracked measures like electronic tagging to alleviate overcrowding. Advocates argue for community sanctions instead of lockup for teens. The Irish Penal Reform Trust points out the high cost of detention, but also the role of background issues. They note many lucky dip kids come from chaotic homes, bereavement or trauma, underscoring that support-based interventions may be smarter than punitive ones. In fact, they highlight a new bail supervision scheme that sends multidisciplinary teams into families' homes, showing early success in reducing re-offending across Dublin and into Leinster. The lucky dip spree has seeded fear. In Tallaght and Blanchardstown, homeowners double-check door locks at night. Parents warn children not to park on driveways. After Farrelly's death, protests erupted outside Garda stations, voices demanding action on both the gang and the bail laws. A Sinn Féin councillor warned that areas like Ballyfermot feel under siege. Locals speak of being on tenterhooks every evening. One resident quietly told a reporter, "It's not safe anymore." Even in your own driveway, you think, "Am I next?" This atmosphere of anxiety is itself a social crime scene. At the same time, some citizens question law enforcement's handcuffed response. Social media threads and community meetings have discussed more radical ideas: curfews for minors, chopping off $200 motorcycles, or empowering Garda with harsher pursuit powers. Legal experts caution that knee-jerk policies could breach rights or fail courts. Instead, voices from community groups and educators are calling for youth mentoring programs and investment in at-risk neighborhoods. Many believe prevention will be as crucial as prosecution. Garda sources privately admit they feel the frustration. The Ballyfermot patrol car crews we shadowed confess a grim determination: more checkpoints, more plainclothes watches, and perhaps more CCTV cameras. But even as they vow to keep up the pressure, they acknowledge that without addressing the loose bail regime and detention gap, each arrested lucky dipper could just be replaced by another. As the sun sets again over Dublin, the lucky dip saga is far from over. The gang's next move is uncertain, but one thing is clear: Ireland's youth crime debate has a new poster child. For policymakers, the crisis highlights legal reforms needed, from smarter bail reviews to expanding juvenile facilities. For communities, it has been a wake-up call. Suburban Dublin must grapple with how privilege, alienation, and opportunity collide in teenage underground culture. Experts suggest balanced remedies. The IPRT argues for intervening early to help change behavior, and even says the cost of doing nothing is high. In the coming weeks, the Garda Commissioner has promised even tougher crackdowns on burglars and joyriders. Meanwhile, education and social services are quietly ramping up outreach in hotspots. In the final analysis, the Lucky Dip gang is both symptom and spectacle of a city in flux where global tech meets local hardship. This Vice-style chronicle leaves viewers with uneasy questions. Will tougher policing quell the teenage raid trains, or will social change dismantle them from within? Only time will tell whether Dublin's community and justice system can break the cycle before the next random target is chosen. Sources: in preparing this script, we drew on investigative reports and court findings about the Lucky Dip gang, as well as Garda commentary cited in Irish media. These provide a factual backbone to the narrative. The result is a dramatized, journalistic documentary voiceover style grounded in real events and expert insights. The Hennessy name was never meant to be whispered in fear. Never meant to be written in the annals of Ireland's most notorious gangland. Was not born into the underworld, nor was he raised with a gun in his hand. He was a fighter, a man who once stood in the ring as a promising young boxer, his fists a weapon of sport rather than survival. He knew discipline, he knew struggle, and he knew how to take a punch and throw one back even harder. But the streets of Dublin have a way of choosing their own champions, and for Jason Hennessy Sr., the path of the righteous was never as rewarding as the path of power. What began as small-time dealings, favor trading, money runs, protection rackets, soon spiraled into something far darker. The same fists that once cracked jawlines under the bright lights of a boxing ring would come to break bones in darkened alleyways, not for sport, but for control. The Dublin underworld is not a place for the weak. The lines between survival and dominance blur, and men like Hennessy learned quickly that mercy is nothing more than a weakness to be exploited. In the shadowed corners of the city, deals were struck in hushed voices, alliances were made and broken with the pull of a trigger, and reputations were built not by words, but by the fear they instilled. Hennessy had no illusions about the nature of his rise. Every inch of territory gained was soaked in blood. His was a world where the only law that mattered was the law of the gun, and the only loyalty that lasted was the kind bought with money or fear. By the late 2010s, Jason Hennessy had solidified his name among the key figures in Dublin's Gangland. He was no longer the young boxer dreaming of a title. He was an enforcer, a strategist, a man whose reputation alone could make rivals think twice before crossing him. His operations spanned from drug distribution to extortion, his connections reaching into some of the most powerful criminal networks in the country. The men who once fought beside him in back-alley brawls were now his foot soldiers, his trusted circle of enforcers who ensured his name was spoken with respect, and more importantly, with fear. But power in the underworld is fleeting. It is an illusion that men like Jason Hennessy Sr. learn to wield with confidence, even as they know deep down that it cannot last. The power he had accumulated, the enemies he had made, it all painted a target on his back. The whispers of betrayal came first, murmurs of discontent among the younger generation of criminals who sought to carve their own names into the underworld. He had seen it before, men who built empires only to watch them crumble when their own men turned against them. The warnings had been there. The tension had been rising. Rivals had been circling, watching for the moment when the great enforcer would lower his guard. And on Christmas Eve 2023, that moment arrived. A quiet evening at Brown's Steakhouse turned into a bloodbath. Gunshots shattered the festive calm, and within moments, the feared crime boss lay bleeding, the life draining from a man who had once seemed invincible. Dublin's Gangland had claimed another victim, and in his death, a new battle began. Not just for revenge, but for the very future of his criminal empire. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. The Hennessy name, once a symbol of unshakable control, was now a house of cards trembling under the weight of uncertainty. Associates who once swore loyalty to Jason Hennessy Sr. began weighing their options. Some sought to align themselves with rising power players. Others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk sharing his fate. And at the center of it all were his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing in the shadow of a murdered kingpin. Now the focus shifts to them. Left with a fractured legacy and a name soaked in blood, they are faced with the ultimate question. Will they rise to reclaim their father's throne, or will they be the next victims in Dublin's relentless cycle of gangland warfare? The Hennessy story is not just another tale of crime. It is a testament to the brutal reality of gangland power, a name built in blood, a name that still echoes in the streets of Dublin, and a name that may yet be written in its history forever. To understand the rise of Jason Hennessy Sr., one must first understand the landscape that shaped him. Dublin's underworld is not just a collection of criminals. It is an evolving, shifting entity, built on the blood and ambition of those who dare to take what they believe is theirs. It is a battleground where alliances are fragile, betrayals are inevitable, and the rules of survival are written in bullets and banknotes. For decades, Dublin's criminal underworld has been dominated by a handful of powerful factions. The old-school gangs, deeply embedded in the city's history, once ran operations with a certain level of structure, a hierarchy where respect mattered almost as much as violence. But as the years went on, a new breed of criminal emerged, more ruthless, more unpredictable, less concerned with codes of honor and more focused on immediate power. The 1990s and early 2000s saw an explosion in Ireland's drug trade, fueled by international cartels and the growing demand for narcotics across Europe. Dublin became a key hub, a city where shipments of cocaine and heroin flowed like currency. As money flooded the streets, so too did violence. Disputes between rival factions escalated into all-out wars, with bodies turning up in alleyways, execution-style killings becoming routine, and gang leaders becoming high-profile targets. It was in this chaotic, blood-soaked environment that Jason Hennessy Sr. made his rise. The old ways of doing business were crumbling, and those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were erased. Hennessy was a man who understood the nature of this new, ruthless underworld. He saw the changing landscape, and rather than fight against it, he became a part of it. A strategist as much as a brute, he built alliances where necessary, eliminated threats when required, and positioned himself as a man to be feared. Dublin's criminal underworld is not a place for the faint-hearted. It is a system built on greed, fueled by desperation, and ruled by those willing to go further than their enemies. Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson well, and in mastering the game, he secured his place in its history. But as with all who rise in this world, the higher they climb, the further they have to fall. As his influence grew, so too did the enemies watching from the shadows. And in Dublin's underworld, a rise to power is never permanent. It is only a matter of time before the streets demand their due. Dublin, a city steeped in history and culture, is also a city where gangsters rise and fall in cycles as predictable as the tides. The criminal underworld is a beast that devours its own, an empire built on violence that ensures no one stays at the top for long. And Jason Hennessy Sr., despite all his cunning, was no exception. Jason Hennessy Sr.'s path into the criminal underworld was not one of inevitability, but of choices. Decisions made in the grim alleys and neon-lit backstreets of Dublin, where survival often comes at the cost of morality. Before he was a feared crime boss, he was a young fighter with promise, a man whose fists spoke louder than words, had solidified his name among the key figures in Dublin's gangland. He was no longer the young boxer dreaming of a title. He was an enforcer, a strategist, a man whose reputation alone could make rivals think twice before crossing him. His operations spanned from drug distribution to extortion, his connections reaching into some of the most powerful criminal networks in the country. The men who once fought beside him in back-alley brawls were now his foot soldiers, his trusted circle of enforcers who ensured his name was spoken with respect, and more importantly, with fear. But power in the underworld is fleeting. It is an illusion that men like Jason Hennessy Sr. learn to wield with confidence, even as they know deep down that it cannot last. The power he had accumulated, the enemies he had made, it all painted a target on his back. The whispers of betrayal came first, murmurs of discontent among the younger generation of criminals who sought to carve their own names into the underworld. He had seen it before, men who built empires only to watch them crumble when their own men turned against them. The warnings had been there. The tension had been rising. Rivals had been circling, watching for the moment when the great enforcer would lower his guard. And on Christmas Eve 2023, that moment arrived. A quiet evening at Brown's Steakhouse turned into a bloodbath. Gunshots shattered the festive calm, and within moments, the feared crime boss lay bleeding, the life draining from a man who had once seemed invincible. Dublin's gangland had claimed another victim, and in his death, a new battle began. Not just for revenge, but for the very future of his criminal empire. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. The Hennessy name, once a symbol of unshakable control, was now a house of cards trembling under the weight of uncertainty. Associates who once swore loyalty to Jason Hennessy Sr. began weighing their options. Some sought to align themselves with rising power players. Others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk sharing his fate. And at the center of it all were his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing in the shadow of a murdered kingpin. Now the focus shifts to them. Left with a fractured legacy and a name soaked in blood, they are faced with the ultimate question. Will they rise to reclaim their father's throne, or will they be the next victims in Dublin's relentless cycle of gangland warfare? The Hennessy story is not just another tale of crime. It is a testament to the brutal reality of gangland power, a name built in blood, a name that still echoes in the streets of Dublin, and a name that may yet be written in its history forever. To understand the rise of Jason Hennessy Sr., one must first understand the landscape that shaped him. Dublin's underworld is not just a collection of criminals. It is an evolving, shifting entity, built on the blood and ambition of those who dare to take what they believe is theirs. It is a battleground where alliances are fragile, betrayals are inevitable, and the rules of survival are written in bullets and banknotes. For decades, Dublin's criminal underworld has been dominated by a handful of powerful factions. The old-school gangs, deeply embedded in the city's history, once ran operations with a certain level of structure, a hierarchy where respect mattered almost as much as violence. But as the years went on, a new breed of criminal emerged, more ruthless, more unpredictable, less concerned with codes of honor and more focused on immediate power. The 1990s and early 2000s saw an explosion in Ireland's drug trade, fueled by international cartels and the growing demand for narcotics across Europe. Dublin became a key hub, a city where shipments of cocaine and heroin flowed like currency. As money flooded the streets, so too did violence. Disputes between rival factions escalated into all-out wars, with bodies turning up in alleyways, execution-style killings becoming routine, and gang leaders becoming high-profile targets. It was in this chaotic, blood-soaked environment that Jason Hennessy Sr. made his rise. The old ways of doing business were crumbling, and those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were erased. Hennessy was a man who understood the nature of this new, ruthless underworld. He saw the changing landscape, and rather than fight against it, he became a part of it. A strategist as much as a brute, he built alliances where necessary, eliminated threats when required, and positioned himself as a man to be feared. Dublin's criminal underworld is not a place for the faint-hearted. It is a system built on greed, fueled by desperation, and ruled by those willing to go further than their enemies. Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson well, and in mastering the game, he secured his place in its history. But as with all who rise in this world, the higher they climb, the further they have to fall. As his influence grew, so too did the enemies watching from the shadows. And in Dublin's underworld, a rise to power is never permanent. It is only a matter of time before the streets demand their due. Dublin, a city steeped in history and culture, is also a city where gangsters rise and fall in cycles, as predictable as the tides. The criminal underworld is a beast that devours its own, an empire built on violence that ensures no one stays at the top for long. And Jason Hennessy Sr., despite all his cunning, was no exception. Jason Hennessy Sr.'s path into the criminal underworld was not one of inevitability, but of choices. Decisions made in the grim alleys and neon-lit backstreets of Dublin, where survival often comes at the cost of morality. Before he was a feared crime boss, he was a young fighter with promise, a man whose fists spoke louder than words. Born into a working-class family, Hennessy Sr. showed early promise in the boxing ring. His quick hands, relentless endurance, and an unbreakable spirit made him a rising star in local circuits. Coaches spoke of his potential, of a future in professional boxing, but the brutal reality of life in Dublin's toughest neighborhoods had a way of pulling young men away from ambition and into something darker. The same traits that made him a dangerous fighter, his discipline, his ability to take punishment, and his sheer force of will, made him an even more formidable presence outside the ring. As he trained, he was drawn into the fringes of Dublin's criminal underbelly. Small-time enforcers began recruiting him for muscle jobs, shaking down debtors, collecting protection money, ensuring that certain people in the neighborhood understood the consequences of stepping out of line. At first, it was just another way to earn money, an easy supplement to the meager earnings from amateur boxing. But soon, the allure of fast cash, respect, and power eclipsed any dreams of championship belts. It wasn't long before Hennessy Sr. had a reputation not just as a boxer, but as a man who could handle himself in any fight, whether inside the ropes or in the back of a nightclub where deals were settled with fists instead of contracts. The criminal world saw in him something useful, a man who was dangerous but disciplined. Unlike the wild, unpredictable thugs who littered the lower rungs of the underworld, Hennessy had a mind for strategy, for control. He began working closely with more established figures in the Dublin underworld, learning the trade of organized crime. The early years were spent as an enforcer, handling collections and intimidation for the higher-ups. But Hennessy was never content to be a foot soldier. He watched, he learned, and most importantly, he waited. By the late 2000s, Hennessy Sr. had built enough connections to branch out on his own. He was no longer just a hired fist. He was making his own moves, running his own rackets. His transition from enforcer to boss was not a dramatic coup, but a slow and calculated process. He formed alliances, cut out the weak links, and took control of key operations: drugs, extortion, and weapons trafficking. With his reputation solidified, Hennessy Sr. was no longer just a feared enforcer. He was becoming a kingpin in his own right. But the higher he climbed, the more enemies he made. Dublin's criminal world had no shortage of men who wanted power, and as Hennessy expanded his empire, he unknowingly set the stage for the betrayals, conflicts, and bloodshed that would define his reign, and ultimately his downfall. Jason Hennessy Sr. did not rise to power simply by throwing punches and intimidating rivals. The world of organized crime is not sustained by brute force alone. It thrives on money, strategy, and the careful balancing act between control and chaos. To solidify his status as a kingpin, Hennessy Sr. had to master the business of crime. Unlike many gangsters who relied solely on violence, Hennessy Sr. understood that power in the criminal underworld was built on financial strength. He diversified his interests early on, ensuring that his income streams were not solely reliant on drugs. Extortion, loan sharking, arms smuggling, and money laundering became pillars of his empire. He established a network that allowed him to funnel illegal profits through legitimate businesses. Bars, nightclubs, construction firms, all of which provided a facade of respectability while masking the dark underbelly of his operation. His most profitable venture, however, was the drug trade. As the demand for cocaine surged in Dublin and beyond, Hennessy positioned himself as a key player in the supply chain. His connections with international traffickers ensured a steady flow of narcotics, which were then distributed through a network of street-level dealers. He did not micromanage street operations himself. Instead, he delegated power, ensuring loyalty through financial incentives and ruthless enforcement. But with great wealth came great threats. Dublin's Gangland was not a peaceful kingdom where one man could rule unchallenged. Rival factions saw Hennessy's success and sought to take a share of his profits. The Underworld was a volatile ecosystem, and alliances were often as fragile as the peace they brokered. Feuds were inevitable. Disputes over territory, unpaid debts, and betrayals led to open warfare in the streets. Hennessy Sr. was not one to shy away from violence when necessary. He understood that fear was as valuable a weapon as any firearm. Those who opposed him were met with swift and brutal consequences. Disappearances, shootings, and public executions became messages sent to those who dared challenge his authority. The blood feuds that defined Dublin's criminal history were not new, but Hennessy played the game differently. He did not engage in reckless violence. Every action was calculated. He preferred to remove threats quietly, using intimidation, bribery, and if necessary, targeted assassinations carried out by trusted hitmen. His ability to balance business acumen with raw aggression made him one of the most feared figures in Ireland's criminal underworld. But with every empire built on crime, there is always a tipping point. As his wealth and influence grew, so too did the pressure from law enforcement, rival gangs, and even those within his own ranks who sought to betray him. The stage was set for the inevitable downfall. The question was not if Jason Hennessy Sr. would fall, but when and at whose hands. Jason Hennessy Sr. may have built a criminal empire, but power in the underworld is never undisputed. Every inch of territory he controlled, every euro he made, came at the expense of someone else, someone who was just as ruthless, just as hungry, and just as willing to kill for control. For every gangster who rose, there were a dozen more watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to take it all away. His enemies were not just faceless rivals. They were men who had once shared drinks with him in backroom meetings, criminals who had stood beside him in alliances of convenience before greed and ambition turned them into adversaries. Dublin's criminal landscape had always been volatile, but by the time Hennessy had reached his peak, the city had become a battleground of shifting allegiances and open warfare. In the early years of his rise, Hennessy had to contend with Dublin's older criminal factions, established figures who had been running the city's drug trade and extortion rackets for decades. These were men who followed a certain code, a set of unspoken rules that kept the underworld from descending into absolute chaos. But Hennessy was not one for tradition. He was part of a new wave of gangsters, men who saw no value in playing by old rules when there was more money to be made by breaking them. This put him at odds with some of the more established figures in Dublin's gangland scene. At first, they tried to control him, offering him a place within their ranks in exchange for loyalty. But Hennessy had no interest in being a subordinate. He was not content with taking orders, he wanted to be the one giving them. When he refused to bow to the old guard, tensions escalated. At first, it was through subtle warnings. Business deals falling apart, shipments being hijacked, informants mysteriously disappearing. But soon the conflict turned bloody. The first real test of Hennessy's strength came in the form of a targeted hit. One of his lieutenants was found dead, his body dumped in an alleyway as a message: stand down or face the consequences. It was a direct challenge, one meant to intimidate him into submission. But instead of retreating, Hennessy retaliated. Within days, one of the men suspected of orchestrating the murder was found executed in his car, 2 bullets to the head in classic gangland fashion. It was a message in return. Hennessy was not afraid to fight back. From that point on, the city became a chessboard of strategic killings, bombings, and street-level clashes. The police struggled to keep up as bodies continued to pile up, and the streets of Dublin became a war zone. As Hennessy expanded his operations, his most dangerous enemies were not just the old guard criminals, but the new highly organized drug cartels operating out of West Dublin. These groups had deep connections to international suppliers, including Spanish and Dutch drug lords who funneled massive amounts of cocaine and heroin into Ireland. Hennessy wanted a bigger share of the drug trade, but the cartels saw him as a threat, an unpredictable wildcard who didn't respect the established distribution channels. Tensions boiled over when one of Hennessy's crews intercepted a shipment that was meant for a rival faction. The response was immediate and brutal. A safe house owned by Hennessy's gang was firebombed, killing 2 of his men inside. It was clear that this was no longer just a turf dispute. It was an all-out war. The violence escalated to levels unseen in years. Cars were rigged with explosives. Contract killers were flown in from Eastern Europe to carry out assassinations. Dublin became a city under siege, and Hennessy was right in the middle of it. But the deadliest threats to Hennessy didn't always come from rival gangs. In the underworld, the closer someone is to you, the more dangerous they become. As the pressure mounted, paranoia began to seep into his organization. Whispers of informants within his ranks reached his ears, and soon trusted allies were turning up dead, executed on nothing more than suspicion. The authorities, seeing the chaos unfold, ramped up their investigations. Key figures in his operation were arrested, and some, facing decades behind bars, chose to talk. One of his most trusted enforcers, a man who had been with him from the early days, turned state witness in exchange for immunity. It was the ultimate betrayal. With every detail he gave to the police, the walls around Hennessy began to close in. By 2022, Jason Hennessy Sr. was fighting battles on all fronts. The police were closing in, his rivals were getting bolder, and his once loyal men were either dead or turning against him. He had built an empire through force, but now that same force was being used to tear it apart. The war could only end one way, with either total victory or complete annihilation. Hennessy knew it, and so did his enemies. Every move from this point forward would be a gamble with life and death hanging in the balance. And then came the hit that changed everything. The Christmas Eve assassination that sent a message to all of Dublin. Jason Hennessy Sr. had made too many enemies, and in the end, one of them got to him first. Christmas Eve is a time of celebration, a night when families gather, streets are lit with festive cheer, and even the hardened criminals of Dublin's underworld lower their guards for a moment of respite. But in the world of organized crime, there is no true peace, only opportunities. And on December 24th, 2023, Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. He had been cautious in his final months, more wary than usual. The streets were whispering, warning of a reckoning long overdue. Hennessy knew he had made too many enemies, played the game too aggressively, left too many bodies in his wake. But power breeds arrogance, and for all his paranoia, he still believed himself untouchable. His network was strong, his reputation even stronger. Few would dare move against him. And so, on that fateful Christmas Eve, Hennessy walked into Brown's Steakhouse in Blanchardstown, a well-known establishment frequented by high-profile figures, both legitimate and otherwise. He was not hiding in the shadows, not moving under the cover of darkness. He was in plain sight, enjoying a meal as if he were still the king of Dublin's underworld. The assassin knew this was the moment. Gangland executions are not random acts of violence. They are calculated, methodical, designed to send a message. Hennessy's murder was no different. Eyewitness accounts later painted a picture of chilling precision. The killer had entered the restaurant unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the festive crowd. No masks, no hurried movements, just a man on a mission. He knew where Hennessy was sitting, knew exactly how much time he had before security, police, or retaliation could follow. Then came the gunshots. Silence turned to chaos in an instant. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the holiday atmosphere, sending patrons diving for cover, glasses smashing, tables overturned in the panic. Hennessy was hit multiple times, center mass, a shot to the neck, and one final round to the head to ensure the job was done. He never had a chance to react, never had time to reach for a weapon or call for his men. In seconds, a criminal empire that had taken years to build was left in ruins, its leader bleeding out on the floor of a high-end steakhouse. Who ordered the hit? Theories and suspects. As the news broke, speculation ran wild. Hennessy had no shortage of enemies, but the nature of the hit suggested more than just personal revenge. It was a strategic move. A message to the entire underworld. Several theories emerged almost immediately. A rival syndicate's power play. The most obvious explanation was that a competing criminal organization had finally decided to eliminate Hennessy. With him out of the picture, his operations were vulnerable, ripe for the taking. Internal betrayal. In the world of organized crime, danger often comes from within. Had one of Hennessy's own men turned against him, lured him into a false sense of security, only to deliver the final blow? Perhaps someone close to him saw the writing on the wall and decided to make their move before they became a target themselves. Cartel involvement. Some speculated that the assassination had been orchestrated by international drug suppliers. Hennessy's increasing ambition had placed him in dangerous waters, stepping on the toes of powerful figures beyond Ireland's borders. Law enforcement's silent hand. While unlikely, there were murmurs that authorities had allowed the hit to happen, turning a blind eye in order to rid Dublin of one of its most dangerous criminals without the need for lengthy legal battles. Dublin's underworld does not simply absorb a blow like this and move on. The murder of a crime boss of Hennessy's stature sent shockwaves through the entire network of criminals, enforcers, and dealers who operated under his influence. Fear gripped his associates. Without their leader, they were vulnerable. Some immediately sought to distance themselves, hoping to avoid the inevitable fallout. Others saw opportunity, maneuvering to claim what remained of his empire. The police response was swift, but largely symbolic. Roadblocks were set up, raids were conducted, but those who truly understood gangland affairs knew that justice, at least in the traditional sense, would never come. There would be no witnesses willing to speak, no smoking gun to tie the killer to a specific organization. This was a professional job, carried out with precision, ensuring that the identity of those responsible would remain shrouded in secrecy. What was clear, however, was that the Hennessy reign had come to an end. But even as the crime boss lay dead, his legacy was far from over. In the days following his assassination, attention turned to his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing at a crossroads. They could fade into obscurity, abandon their father's criminal path, and carve out their own lives. Or they could embrace the blood-soaked legacy left behind, stepping into the void that his death had created. And in the underworld of Dublin, power vacuums never last for long. When a king falls, the vultures circle. Jason Hennessy Sr. had spent years building his reputation, carving his name into Dublin's underworld through violence, strategic alliances, and sheer force of will. But in the criminal world, power is fleeting. The moment a crime boss is taken off the board, his empire begins to unravel. Trust dissolves, allies reconsider their loyalties, and rivals sharpen their knives. Hennessy's assassination was not just the end of a man. It was the beginning of a war. Dublin had seen its fair share of gangland killings, but this one was different. Hennessy was not a disposable foot soldier, not just another name on the ever-growing list of fallen criminals. He was a power player, a man whose influence reached deep into the criminal economy. His network had extended beyond just drug dealing. He controlled extortion rings, protection rackets, money laundering operations, and had strong ties to international suppliers. And now all of it was up for grabs. Within hours of his death, the balance of power had shifted. His men, once fiercely loyal, now found themselves directionless, uncertain of what came next. Some disappeared into the shadows, unwilling to die in a war they had no stake in. Others immediately sought new allegiances, offering their services to rival factions in exchange for security. The empire Hennessy had built was fracturing at its core, and every gang in the city saw an opportunity to claim a piece of it. In the wake of Hennessy's assassination, three major forces moved to stake their claim over his criminal operations. The rival factions, the West Dublin cartels, longtime competitors of Hennessy's empire, saw his death as a golden opportunity. These organizations, well connected to international drug suppliers, had been waiting for a moment like this. With Hennessy gone, they could absorb his street-level dealers, take over his distribution networks, and eliminate any remaining opposition. The Loyalists. Not everyone was willing to let go of the Hennessy legacy. A faction of his closest enforcers, men who had been with him since the beginning, vowed to protect his name. But without a clear leader, they lacked direction. The question remained, who would rise to take command? The Hennessy sons, the most unpredictable element in the equation. While they had been raised in the shadow of their father's empire, they had never held real power. Now, with their father's empire crumbling, they had a choice: walk away or fight to reclaim what was theirs. Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother had grown up in a world where crime was business, violence was a tool, and power was everything. They had seen their father operate, learned the rules of the game from a young age. But watching from the sidelines and stepping onto the battlefield were two very different things. In the days after their father's assassination, the brothers were left with an impossible decision. If they walked away, they could escape the cycle of bloodshed that had defined their father's life. They had the money, the connections, and the opportunity to start fresh. But in the underworld, walking away is rarely that simple. Their father's name was still feared. His legacy had weight. And with his death, many of his associates, men who had built their lives under his protection, looked to them for guidance. To some, they were the rightful heirs to the empire. To others, they were nothing more than boys playing at a man's game, untested and vulnerable. For the Hennessy sons, stepping into their father's shoes was not just about reclaiming power, it was about survival. If they did not take control, someone else would. And in the world their father had built, weakness was a death sentence. Jason Hennessy Jr. wasted no time in making his intentions clear. Within days of his father's funeral, he called a meeting of his father's remaining loyalists. The location was carefully chosen, neutral ground, a place where no one could pull a gun without suffering immediate consequences. The message was simple. The Hennessy name was not finished. But words were not enough. The brothers needed to prove themselves, to show that they were not just inheriting power, but seizing it. And in the criminal world, there is only one way to do that: through action. Their first move came swiftly and without hesitation. A known associate of the rival factions, a man suspected of orchestrating their father's murder, was found beaten to death in an alleyway. No witnesses, no cameras, just a silent message written in blood. The Hennessy family was still in play. The response was immediate. The rival cartels, seeing the Hennessy sons as nothing more than a nuisance, began to push harder, applying pressure on their remaining operations. Safe houses were raided, shipments hijacked, and informants strategically placed to feed law enforcement information. The war had officially begun. As the Hennessy brothers fought to maintain control, the rest of Dublin's criminal network watched carefully. Some saw potential, young blood with something to prove, a name still powerful enough to command loyalty. Others saw an inevitable downfall, two inexperienced heirs playing a deadly game they did not fully understand. For the police, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, the infighting within the Hennessy ranks meant more chances to dismantle their network. On the other, it meant more bloodshed, more public executions, and more civilians caught in the crossfire. The Hennessy name was no longer just a symbol of past power. It was a battlefield. The question was no longer who would take power. It was whether the Hennessy brothers could survive long enough to hold on to it. The criminal world is unforgiving. It does not wait for men to grow into their roles, does not offer second chances. The brothers had made their choice, and now they had to prove themselves the only way the underworld understood. Through dominance, through strategy, and through sheer, relentless force. The legacy of Jason Hennessy Sr. was built on blood, and if his sons wished to carry it forward, they would have to be prepared to spill plenty of their own. A name can be both a shield and a target. For Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother, their surname carried weight, a legacy built on fear, power, and blood. In the criminal underworld of Dublin, being the son of a slain crime boss came with expectations. To some, they were the natural heirs to their father's empire, destined to take the reins and continue his work. To others, they were nothing more than boys playing at a man's game, inexperienced and vulnerable in a world that devoured weakness. But one thing was certain: walking away was never an option. With Jason Hennessy dead, his empire was in disarray. The drug trade, extortion rackets, and money laundering operations he had carefully built were now battlegrounds. Rival factions were closing in, waiting for the perfect moment to seize what remained. If the Hennessy brothers wanted to survive, they had to act fast. Before their father's assassination, the Hennessy sons had lived in the periphery of gangland life. While they were no strangers to violence, their father had kept them at arm's length from the worst of it. He had spent years shielding them from the blood-soaked realities of his business, ensuring they were respected but not yet feared. That protection was gone. With their father dead, the brothers had no choice but to step forward. They had seen how quickly power crumbled when left unattended. If they hesitated, they would be erased from the underworld entirely. And so they made their first move. In Dublin's criminal world, power is not inherited, it is taken. The first test of their authority came in the form of retaliation. The whispers on the street had pointed to a few key figures as the masterminds behind their father's murder. Whether the intelligence was accurate or not didn't matter. What mattered was sending a message. Within 2 weeks of Jason Hennessy Sr.'s death, a known lieutenant of a rival faction was found dead. The scene was brutal, a deliberate display meant to instill fear. His body, riddled with bullets, was left on a public street in the early hours of the morning. No attempts were made to hide it. This was not a silent assassination. It was an announcement. The reaction was immediate. The rival factions, seeing the Hennessy brothers as a growing threat, escalated their aggression. Safe houses were raided, drug shipments intercepted, and informants began feeding law enforcement crucial intelligence. The war had officially begun. Despite their bold opening moves, the Hennessy brothers faced an undeniable problem. They had no real experience running a criminal empire. Their father had spent years building relationships, navigating the treacherous politics of gangland life, and balancing alliances with brute force. Jason Jr. and his brother, however, were young, impulsive, and untested. Respect in the underworld was earned through reputation, and they had yet to prove themselves beyond their surname. Some of their father's old associates remained loyal, but many questioned their ability to lead. Were they ruthless enough? Were they strategic enough? Could they hold their own against seasoned criminals who had been playing this game for decades? The brothers knew that one misstep could spell their end. As the brothers fought to secure their father's empire, law enforcement saw an opportunity. With Jason Hennessy Sr. dead, his once well-structured criminal operation had become chaotic. The sudden infighting, the reckless retaliations, and the public displays of violence all played into the hands of the authorities. Surveillance operations intensified. Wiretaps were authorized. Long-standing investigations that had failed to bring down Hennessy Sr. were restructured with one goal in mind: preventing his sons from rising. It was a race against time. If the Hennessy brothers could consolidate power quickly, they could establish themselves as the new leaders of the underworld. If they faltered, they would either end up dead or in prison before they had a chance to make their mark. But leadership is rarely shared, and cracks within the Hennessy ranks were beginning to show. Jason Hennessy Jr., the eldest, naturally assumed the role of leader. He was the face of their resurgence, the one making the critical decisions, the one handling negotiations and issuing orders. His younger brother, however, had a different approach. More impulsive, more prone to reckless acts of violence, he saw fear as the quickest path to dominance. Tensions between them simmered beneath the surface. Some of their father's former associates favored Jason Jr.'s measured, strategic approach, believing that brute force alone would not be enough to maintain power. Others, however, gravitated toward his younger brother's ruthless ambition, seeing in him a reflection of their father's more violent tendencies. A divide was forming, one that threatened to collapse their fragile empire before it could even solidify. The Hennessy brothers had made their choice. They would not fade into the background. They would not relinquish their father's empire without a fight. But the path they had chosen was one paved with blood, betrayal, and endless war. Could they hold their ground long enough to establish themselves as true power players in Dublin's underworld? Or were they merely inheritors of a doomed legacy, destined to fall as their father had? One thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The city was watching, their enemies were waiting, and the next move would determine whether the Hennessy name would rise once more or be buried forever. Violence had always been a tool in the Hennessy family's arsenal. It was how Jason Hennessy Sr. had built his empire, through intimidation, brutal enforcement, and the careful application of fear. His sons inherited that philosophy, but unlike their father, they lacked restraint. What had once been calculated displays of power turned into reckless, unchecked brutality. And it was this shift, their inability to control their impulses, that would lead to one of the most shocking gangland crimes in recent memory. The moment the Hennessy brothers took over, they knew they had to prove themselves. But fear is a dangerous currency. Too little, and they would be seen as weak. Too much, and they would become liabilities, both to their own men and to the authorities. Their biggest mistake? They overplayed their hand. The victim was not a major rival, not a cartel boss or a high-ranking enforcer. He was a small-time dealer, a man caught between warring factions. Rumors swirled that he had fed information to a rival gang, or worse, to law enforcement. In the world of organized crime, such suspicions alone were often enough to warrant death. But instead of carrying out a quiet execution, the Hennessy brothers wanted to make an example out of him. The details of what happened next are gruesome, so brutal that even hardened criminals whispered about it in shock. The man was abducted from the streets of West Dublin, thrown into a van, and driven to a secret location where he was held captive for hours. The Hennessy brothers, along with a small group of their most trusted enforcers, took turns interrogating him. But this was never about gathering information. This was about sending a message. Gangland justice is swift and often final. But what the Hennessy brothers did went beyond anything their father had ever sanctioned. The victim was beaten, burned, and tortured in ways that stunned even those who operated in the shadows. Branded with a hot iron, a mark seared into his flesh, forever labeling him as a traitor. Teeth shattered with a hammer, a grim reminder that speaking out had consequences. Cuts and burns, designed not to kill, but to maximize suffering. When he was finally dumped on the streets, barely alive, his body told the story the Hennessy brothers wanted the world to hear. Betray us, and this is what happens. But the message was louder than they had anticipated. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through Dublin's underworld. Even among criminals, there are unspoken rules, limits to how far one can go before the violence becomes bad for business. The Hennessy brothers had not just made an enemy out of one man. They had alienated powerful figures who saw their methods as reckless and unsustainable. Where their father had been feared and respected, they were now feared and hated. Their men began to question their leadership. Was this what the new Hennessy rule would look like? Torture, chaos, and indiscriminate violence? Would their brutality make them untouchable, or would it draw too much heat from both their enemies and the police? The answer came swiftly. The Irish police, already watching the Hennessy brothers closely, now had the justification they needed to launch a full-scale operation against them. This was no longer just another gangland feud. This was national news. The victim, despite his injuries, had survived long enough to become a witness, and the details he provided were damning. Within days, armed raids were conducted on properties linked to the Hennessy gang. Several associates were arrested, and key evidence was seized: phones, weapons, and financial records that painted a clear picture of their expanding empire. But the biggest prize still eluded them: the brothers themselves. Knowing the Garda E were closing in, Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother vanished from public view. They moved between safe houses, using burner phones and trusted associates to communicate. But no matter how careful they were, the walls were closing in. The torture case had changed everything. It had turned the Hennessy brothers from rising crime lords into high-priority targets. Rivals saw weakness in their recklessness, sensing an opportunity to strike while they were distracted by the police. Informants, once too terrified to speak, now saw an opening to cut deals. The Hennessy name, once synonymous with calculated power, was becoming a liability. For the brothers, there were only two choices: double down on their reign of terror and hope to survive the backlash, or find a way to regain the control they had so carelessly lost. The next move would determine their fate. In the world of organized crime, justice is not handed down in courtrooms or decided by juries. It is swift, ruthless, and often final. For those who cross the wrong people, the punishment is not measured in years behind bars, but in pain, blood, and the slow, creeping certainty that death is coming. The Hennessy brothers had embraced this brutal reality, perhaps too much. Their father had understood the power of fear. He had used violence as a tool, a controlled instrument to maintain order and dominance. But Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother had turned it into a spectacle, a display of cruelty that went beyond the unspoken rules of gangland tradition. The torture of their victim had not just sent a message to rivals, it had also sent shockwaves through their own network. And in Dublin's underworld, when a gangster begins making enemies on all sides, the inevitable reckoning is not far behind. Irish organized crime has always operated by a set of unspoken rules, passed down through generations of gangland figures who understood the delicate balance between power and chaos. Violence was necessary, but excessive brutality was bad for business. The old-school criminals, the ones who had built their empires through calculated strategy rather than reckless bloodshed, viewed the Hennessy brothers with growing disdain. Their father had been feared, yes, but he had also been respected. The new generation? They were little more than executioners without restraint, too eager to make statements, too willing to draw attention to themselves. And in the world of gangland justice, that kind of behavior was not tolerated for long. The torture case had painted a target on the Hennessy brothers' backs, and it wasn't just law enforcement that was closing in. Rival factions saw their growing instability as an opportunity to strike. There were whispers in the streets, quiet conversations in the back rooms of pubs, plans being drawn up in the dark corners of Dublin's criminal underworld. The brothers had crossed a line, and now they had to pay the price. The first blow came within weeks. One of their closest lieutenants, a man who had been with them since their father's reign, was found dead in his car. 2 bullets to the head. A professional job. There was no warning, no chance for retaliation. It was a cold, methodical hit, designed to show the brothers that their enemies were moving in. Then came the ambush. A safe house used by the Hennessy gang was firebombed in the middle of the night. The explosion ripped through the building, killing at least 1 associate and severely injuring 2 others. By the time authorities arrived, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew. It was only the beginning. As the violence escalated, the Hennessy brothers were forced into hiding. They could no longer move freely through the city without the risk of an ambush. Safe houses became temporary refuges, abandoned as quickly as they were found. They relied on burner phones, encrypted messages, and a dwindling circle of trusted men. But paranoia is a dangerous thing in the underworld. They began suspecting everyone, associates, old allies, even their own men. The once loyal network their father had built was crumbling under the pressure. Some sought protection under rival factions, willing to trade information in exchange for their lives. Others simply disappeared, choosing to flee Dublin rather than be caught in the inevitable bloodbath. And through it all, the Hennessy brothers knew one undeniable truth. This war would not end until either they were dead or their enemies were. In gangland warfare, there are few things more effective than a public execution. One night, a known associate of the Hennessy brothers was dragged from his home and executed on the street. Witnesses reported masked gunmen, professional and efficient. They fired with precision, leaving the body where it fell, a statement to anyone watching. This was more than just another killing. It was a declaration. The Hennessy brothers were losing control. For the Gardaí, the ongoing bloodshed presented a rare opportunity. Gangland figures were always difficult to prosecute. Witnesses rarely spoke. Evidence was hard to come by, and intimidation kept most informants silent. But the chaos surrounding the Hennessy brothers was different. The violence was drawing attention, and with it came the chance to dismantle their operation once and for all. Surveillance was intensified. Phone lines were tapped. Informants were cultivated from the ranks of frightened former allies. Law enforcement knew that while taking down Jason Hennessy Sr. had been a challenge, his sons were not nearly as careful. And they were right. Mistakes were being made. The brothers were desperate, careless. The empire they were trying to hold on to was slipping from their grasp, and in their attempts to keep control, they were leaving a trail of evidence behind. As the walls closed in, the Hennessy brothers had 2 choices. Strike first, go on the offensive, eliminate their enemies before they could be taken down. Run, disappear before the law, or their rivals could catch them. But the streets of Dublin do not forget, and neither do the men who rule them. Gangland justice is brutal, merciless, and absolute. The Hennessy brothers had built their reputation on fear, on violence, on their willingness to go further than anyone else. Now that same violence was coming for them. The only question was, how much longer could they outrun it? For years, Jason Hennessy Sr. had operated within the shadows, careful, methodical, always one step ahead of the law. His empire had flourished despite constant scrutiny from the Gardaí, who had struggled to pin down evidence solid enough to bring him down. But after his assassination, everything changed. His sons, reckless and impulsive, lacked the discipline that had kept their father out of prison. Where Jason Hennessy Sr. had built his power on calculated moves and careful alliances, his sons had fueled their rise with raw brutality. And that was their greatest weakness. The law had been waiting for them to make mistakes. And now, with their enemies circling and their men betraying them, the walls were beginning to close in. Chabene. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was alive, the Gardaí had struggled to gather intelligence on his operations. His network was airtight, his inner circle deeply loyal, and his ability to operate just outside the reach of the law made him an elusive target. But his sons? They had left a trail of violence too large to ignore. The torture case had been the turning point. It had provided law enforcement with something they rarely got in gangland cases, a witness willing to testify. Despite severe injuries, the victim had survived, and in the weeks following the attack, he became the centerpiece of a new Garda operation aimed at dismantling the Hennessy network once and for all. The case was given top priority. Special units within the Garda, those trained to combat organized crime, were assigned to track the Hennessy brothers' movements. Surveillance operations expanded. Wiretaps were authorized. Financial records were scrutinized. And for the first time in years, the law had momentum. The Hennessy brothers had always known that trust was the most fragile currency in the underworld. Their father had maintained an iron grip on his men, ensuring loyalty through both fear and rewards. But after his death, that grip had loosened. The increasing violence, the reckless displays of power, the chaos surrounding their leadership, it all made their associates nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. The Gardaí played on this fear. Slowly, carefully, they began flipping members of the Hennessy gang. Low-level foot soldiers, small-time dealers, and even some of their enforcers, men who had once sworn loyalty to the brothers, now saw an opportunity to save themselves. Deals were made. Confidential informants were placed. Information trickled in. And with every new piece of intelligence, the Gardaí tightened the noose. The first major crackdown came in the form of coordinated raids across Dublin. At dawn, heavily armed Gardaí units stormed multiple properties linked to the Hennessy gang. Safe houses, drug stash points, and known meeting spots were all targeted simultaneously. Over a dozen men were arrested in a single morning. Some were caught with illegal firearms. Others were found with large quantities of cash and drugs, evidence that tied them directly to the Hennessy operation. But the real targets, the brothers themselves, remained out of reach. They had gone into hiding, moving between locations, using burner phones, relying on a dwindling circle of trusted men. The Gardaí knew they were still in the city, but their time was running out. The mistake that changed everything. For all their caution, the Hennessy brothers could not remain ghosts forever. It was a routine traffic stop that sealed their fate. A vehicle, flagged by the Gardaí as potentially linked to the Hennessy gang, was pulled over in the middle of the night. Inside, a courier, one of the few remaining men still loyal to the brothers. His job had been simple: transport money to a safe location, ensuring the gang's financial reserves remained hidden. But he panicked. Instead of keeping his cool, he made a run for it. The chase was short, ending with his arrest. And when the Gardaí searched the vehicle, they found what they had been hoping for: an encrypted phone with direct communication between the courier and the Hennessy brothers. It was the break they needed. Within hours, they had traced the phone's last known locations, identifying several properties where the brothers had likely been hiding. The final phase of the operation was set in motion. The raid was swift, calculated, and overwhelming. A convoy of Gardaí tactical units moved in on a quiet suburban home in West Dublin, a property believed to be the last remaining safe house for the brothers. They had nowhere left to run. Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother were found inside, surrounded by a small group of armed enforcers. For a moment, it seemed like they might try to fight their way out. One last act of defiance against the inevitable. But there was no escape. The house was surrounded. Every exit was covered. And as heavily armed officers breached the doors, the brothers knew their reign had come to an end. The arrest was captured on camera, broadcast across news stations, a symbol of the fall of the once feared Hennessy empire. And with them in custody, the final chapter of their criminal legacy was about to be written. The fall of the Hennessy brothers was a spectacle. From their reckless rise to power, their descent into unchecked violence, and their desperate attempts to cling to their father's empire, it had all led to this: arrests in broad daylight, handcuffs tightening around their wrists as cameras captured the final moments of their freedom. For the Gardaí, it was a victory years in the making. For the streets of Dublin, it was the closing of one chapter in a never-ending cycle of gangland power struggles. But for Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother, it was the beginning of something far worse than death. Prison, trials, and the slow unraveling of everything they had built. From the moment news of their arrests broke, the Hennessy brothers became front-page material. Journalists, crime analysts, and former law enforcement officials dissected their every move, recounting their violent history, the brutality of their reign, and the ruthless efficiency with which they had dismantled rivals. Television debates speculated on the trial ahead, while newspapers ran exposés on their empire, detailing drug shipments, money laundering operations, and connections to international crime syndicates. The public, long accustomed to gangland violence, now had faces to go with the headlines, and with that exposure came an undeniable truth. The Hennessy brothers were no longer just criminals. They were symbols. To some, they were cautionary tales, proof that no gangster could outrun the law forever. To others, they were martyrs of the streets, young men who had been forced into a life they never truly controlled. But in the courtroom, neither public opinion nor reputation would save them. From the moment they were processed, the legal system moved quickly. The Gardaí, knowing the brothers were high-profile targets, placed them in protective custody, ensuring they made it to trial without incident. The charges against them were staggering: aggravated assault and torture, tied directly to the case that had sparked the final police crackdown; murder and conspiracy to commit murder, based on intelligence linking them to at least 2 high-profile gangland hits; drug trafficking, large-scale operations that extended beyond Ireland, with confirmed ties to international suppliers; illegal firearm possession; weapons seized during raids, some linked to previous criminal activity; money laundering, millions of euros funneled through shell businesses, a practice inherited from their father's operation. For prosecutors, this was more than just another gangland trial. This was their chance to dismantle what was left of the Hennessy empire, to send a message to the next generation of criminals waiting in the wings. The state was seeking maximum sentences. The brothers, if convicted on all charges, were looking at life in prison. The first day of the trial was chaos. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse: journalists, rival gang members, and even supporters of the brothers who saw them as products of their environment rather than masterminds of organized crime. Security was tightened, with armed officers positioned at every entrance. Inside, the prosecution laid out their case with brutal efficiency. They painted the brothers as violent, power-hungry criminals who had escalated gangland violence to unprecedented levels. They brought forward witness after witness: former associates turned informants, forensic analysts, victims of their crimes. Surveillance footage, phone records, financial documents, all were presented in a damning sequence that left little room for doubt. The defense, however, had its own strategy. Their lawyers argued that while the brothers had been involved in illegal activities, they were not the masterminds the prosecution claimed. They shifted blame to rivals, disputed evidence, and attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of key witnesses, especially the informants, many of whom had cut deals with the state in exchange for lighter sentences. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the prosecution's case was strong. And then the unthinkable happened. "Oi, SRDB as a deal on the table, will the brothers turn?" As the evidence mounted, whispers began circulating. Were the Hennessy brothers considering cutting a deal? To the outside world, it seemed impossible. Their father had ruled by fear, had built an empire based on loyalty and silence. To betray the code of the streets was to sign one's own death warrant. But the reality of life behind bars was different. The brothers knew they were outmatched. The case against them was airtight, the witness testimonies overwhelming. A life sentence loomed over them like a guillotine, and even prison was no guarantee of survival. So when prosecutors quietly offered a reduced sentence in exchange for key intelligence on Dublin's criminal networks, the question became, would they take it? If they did, they would walk free someday. If they refused, they might never see the outside world again. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. Jason Hennessy Jr. sat expressionless, his younger brother tense beside him. The judge read the decision, count by count. Guilty. The words rang through the room, sealing their fate. For their most serious crimes, murder, torture, and drug trafficking, they received consecutive life sentences. The empire their father had built, the power they had tried to reclaim, it had all ended with the cold steel of prison bars. And as they were led away, shackled and surrounded by guards, the streets of Dublin erupted in a mixture of triumph and fury. Ni adi sa'a. With the Hennessy brothers locked away, the underworld was left in a state of flux. Their empire, once vast and feared, had crumbled. Rival factions moved in to claim what remained, carving up the drug trade, dividing territories, and rewriting the rules of the city's criminal landscape. But even behind bars, the brothers were not entirely powerless. Would they orchestrate revenge from within prison? Would they survive the inevitable attacks from rivals also serving time? Or had the cycle finally ended? In the underworld, nothing stays buried forever. And though the Hennessy brothers had been silenced, their name still carried weight. A name that, for better or worse, would never be forgotten. No empire exists in isolation. The Hennessy crime family was not just a group of ruthless gangsters operating in a vacuum. Their rise and ultimate fall was deeply intertwined with Dublin's wider criminal network, a web of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals that stretched far beyond just one name. Even with the brothers behind bars, the underworld they had fought to dominate was still shifting, still evolving, still carving out its next rulers. Their downfall had not just left a power vacuum in their own organization, it had sent ripples through the entire criminal landscape. And those ripples would shape the future of organized crime in Dublin for years to come. The Hennessys were powerful, but they were never the only game in town. Dublin's criminal network was made up of multiple factions, each with their own areas of influence, each playing their own game of power and survival. With the brothers locked away, a new battle began. Not just between rival gangs, but between the men who had once stood beside them. The Kinahan cartel had long been one of the most dominant forces in Irish organised crime. Their reach extended far beyond Dublin, stretching into the UK, Spain, and even the Middle East. Their control of the drug trade was absolute, their financial power unparalleled. Unlike the Hennessy operation, which was rooted in local gangland politics, the Kinahans operated on an entirely different level, structured, professional, almost corporate in their efficiency. For years, Jason Hennessy Sr. had managed to exist alongside them, careful never to step on their toes. But his sons had been reckless. Their unrestrained violence, their increasing ambition, it had made them a liability, and some believed the Kinahans had played a role in ensuring their downfall. With the Hennessys out of the picture, their influence grew even stronger. They absorbed key players from the remnants of the empire, secured more territory, and continued to run their operations with the kind of discipline that had kept them at the top for so long. But even giants can fall. International law enforcement had been tightening the noose around the Kinahans for years. With major figures within the cartel now wanted men, the once untouchable empire was facing pressures that even their wealth and power might not withstand. And that meant opportunities for others. While the Kinahans dominated international drug smuggling, it was the West Dublin cartels that controlled much of the street-level distribution. These groups were violent, unpredictable, and far less structured than their larger counterparts, and they had been waiting for this moment. With the Hennessys gone, they moved quickly to claim the territories and drug routes that had once belonged to them. Former Hennessy enforcers, left without leadership, were quickly recruited, offered protection in exchange for loyalty. What made these cartels particularly dangerous was their lack of hierarchy. Unlike the old-school crime families, these were looser affiliations of criminals, operating in smaller independent cells. There was no single leader to target, no clear structure to dismantle, and that made them almost impossible to stop. Perhaps the most dangerous development in the aftermath of the Hennessy collapse was the rise of a new generation of criminals. Young men who had grown up watching gangsters like Jason Hennessy Sr. rule the streets only to see his sons fall in spectacular fashion. These were not the old-school criminals who understood restraint, who knew when to strike and when to wait. They were reckless, fearless, and desperate to make a name for themselves. For many, the downfall of the Hennessy brothers was not a warning. It was an invitation, a sign that power could shift, that new players could rise if they were willing to be brutal enough, daring enough, and ruthless enough. And so the cycle of violence continued. Organized crime does not exist without connections. The Hennessy empire had been built not just on violence, but on relationships. Relationships that extended beyond the underworld and into the very fabric of society. The question that lingered in the wake of their downfall was simple. Who had helped them stay in power for so long? It was no secret that corruption had always played a role in Ireland's law enforcement history. The Gardaí had fought tirelessly against gangland crime, but in every system there were cracks. Some officers had turned a blind eye to Hennessy operations in exchange for payoffs. Others had actively fed information to the gang, warning them about upcoming raids, providing them with just enough knowledge to stay one step ahead. Now, with the brothers in prison, investigations were quietly underway into just how deep that corruption ran. Names were being whispered, internal affairs was watching, and reputations were hanging in the balance. It wasn't just the police. The criminal economy in Dublin was a multi-million euro enterprise. And with that kind of money, influence spread far beyond the streets. developers who needed problems to disappear from construction sites, business owners who paid protection fees to ensure their shops weren't burned to the ground, and politicians, some of whom had been accused of taking donations from untraceable sources, money that had undoubtedly passed through criminal hands at some point. While no one in the political sphere would ever admit to direct involvement, the question remained: how much had the system tolerated, ignored, or even benefited from the Hennessy operation while it was still thriving? With the Hennessy brothers in prison, the war for control was far from over. Would the Kinahans continue to dominate? Would the West Dublin cartels rise to take their place? Would the new generation of criminals, more reckless and unpredictable than ever, plunge the city into another cycle of bloodshed? Or would law enforcement, finally armed with enough intelligence, strike a fatal blow to Dublin's criminal empires once and for all? For the Hennessy brothers, their time was up. But for the underworld they left behind, the real battle was just beginning. Dublin's gangland history is filled with stories of rising criminals, men who clawed their way to power through violence, intimidation, and strategic alliances. But the Hennessy brothers, despite their ambition, were never the true apex predators of the underworld. That title belonged to the Kinahan cartel. To understand why the Hennessys ultimately fell, one must examine the organization that towered above them, an empire so vast that it made local Dublin gangs look like petty criminals in comparison. The Kinahans were not just another crime syndicate. They were an international machine, corporate in structure, global in reach, and untouchable for decades. And when the Hennessy brothers stepped too far into their domain, their fate may have been sealed long before they ever realized it. Unlike the chaotic street-level operations of most Dublin gangs, the Kinahan cartel functioned with military precision. Their leader, Daniel Kinahan, transformed the organization into one of the most formidable criminal enterprises in Europe, with operations stretching from Ireland to Spain, Dubai, and South America. Where Jason Hennessy Sr. had ruled through force, the Kinahans ruled through structure. They had high-level connections in banking, politics, and international trade. Their drug shipments came in by the ton, not the kilogram. They didn't deal in street-corner transactions. They controlled entire supply chains, port authorities, and logistics companies that made their narcotics pipeline nearly invisible to law enforcement. And crucially, they knew how to eliminate threats. If you were an ally, you thrived. If you were a rival, you disappeared. The Hennessy brothers had tried to rise too quickly, expanding their operations in a way that inevitably placed them in the cartel's crosshairs. Their reckless violence had drawn attention. Their erratic leadership had destabilized criminal networks, and worst of all, they had started interfering with drug routes, personnel, and cash flow that didn't belong to them. For the Kinahans, this was unacceptable. In the world of organized crime, assassinations are rarely random. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was executed, speculation immediately turned to his many enemies. But there was always the question of whether the Kinahans had orchestrated the hit behind the scenes. The cartel had a long history of wiping out problematic figures in Irish crime. The infamous Hutch-Kinahan feud had already left a trail of bodies across Dublin and Spain, proving that the cartel had no hesitation in eliminating threats publicly and with overwhelming force. So when Hennessy Sr. was gunned down in Brown's Steakhouse, many insiders whispered the same question. Had the Kinahans decided he was becoming too much of a liability? For years he had been tolerated, useful in his own way, but never truly in control. However, his sons were a different story. Their reckless ambition and their inability to maintain order made them dangerous, not just to themselves, but to the delicate balance of power that the Kinahans had spent years crafting. The cartel thrived on stability, a structured system where their operations could function without unnecessary attention. The Hennessy brothers? They were chaos incarnate, and chaos is bad for business. It is entirely possible that the Kinahans didn't need to pull the trigger themselves. They simply let their rivals handle it, allowing the Hennessys to self-destruct under the weight of their own reckless violence. But whether they were directly involved or not, one fact remained. The Hennessys were gone, and the Kinahans remained standing. The collapse of the Hennessy operation did not mean an end to their business. It meant a transfer of power. The Kinahan cartel moved quickly to seize the most valuable assets left behind, ensuring that whatever the Hennessys had built would now serve them. The Hennessy brothers had controlled key supply lines, but without their leadership, those routes needed new owners. The Kinahans, already deeply embedded in international drug smuggling, absorbed the remaining Hennessy dealers, eliminating anyone who refused to switch sides. One of the most critical aspects of organized crime is moving dirty money without detection. The Hennessy family had their own methods: shell businesses, real estate investments, and offshore accounts. But they were amateurs compared to the Kinahans. After their fall, financial investigations found that some of their operations had seamlessly merged with cartel-controlled entities, proving that those who remained loyal to the Kinahans would continue making money, while those who didn't were discarded. For the enforcers, drug runners, and lieutenants who had once served the Hennessys, loyalty meant nothing once their leaders were gone. The Kinahans provided a simple choice: join them and continue working in the trade, with better organization, more resources, and greater security. Refuse and suffer the consequences. Many of the Hennessy foot soldiers saw the writing on the wall. They switched allegiance, choosing survival over a lost cause. But those who had been too loyal to the brothers, too involved in their violent feuds, found themselves systematically hunted down. For years, the Kinahan cartel had seemed untouchable. But recently, global law enforcement agencies, including the U.S., DEA, and European police forces, have made dismantling the Kinahans a priority. Sanctions have been placed on key figures. Millions of euros in assets have been frozen. High-profile cartel members have fled to Dubai, Spain, and other safe havens, trying to escape the ever-growing reach of international authorities. For the first time in decades, their iron grip on Irish organized crime is beginning to crack. And the question now is, the Hennessy brothers tried to become something greater, to carve out their own legacy in the underworld. They failed, but their story is not unique. Dublin's criminal history is a repeating cycle of rise and fall, where new names emerge, new factions rise, and old ones are buried in shallow graves. The Kinahans still hold the throne, but law enforcement pressure is at an all-time high. Their enemies are waiting for weakness, hungry for the chance to claim power for themselves. So as one empire collapses and another fights for survival, the streets remain the same: blood-soaked, ruthless, and always waiting for the next king to claim the crown. No gangster ever truly rests in peace. In the underworld, death is rarely the end of a story. It is the beginning of something far worse. A killing isn't just an act of violence, it is a statement, a challenge, a promise of further bloodshed. Every murder demands a response, every betrayal breeds new enemies, and every empire that falls leaves behind men with scores to settle. The Hennessy brothers may be behind bars, their empire shattered, but their legacy still lingers in the form of unfinished business. The bodies they left in their wake, the lives they destroyed, none of it has been forgotten. And in the world of gangland crime, revenge is never a question of if, only when. The streets of Dublin have long been shaped by cycles of violence that span decades. Gangland history is not simply a sequence of rising and falling crime bosses. It is a chain reaction, where one killing sparks another, where the past never stays buried. The Hutch-Kinahan feud is perhaps the most infamous example. What began as a personal grudge escalated into a war that claimed dozens of lives across Ireland and Spain. With assassinations, public executions, and international manhunts, turning the dispute into one of the deadliest gang conflicts in Europe. The lesson? Once a war begins, it rarely ends cleanly. The Hennessy family's downfall did not bring peace to Dublin's underworld. It only created a new power struggle, a new wave of vendettas, and a new generation of criminals waiting to settle old debts. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was assassinated, his death was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of violent rivalries. His sons tried to retaliate, but their reckless attempts only created more enemies than they could handle. Now, with the brothers in prison, the question remains: who still wants payback? Gangsters don't just kill criminals, they kill fathers, sons, and brothers. And in Dublin's underworld, family loyalty runs deep. There are many men still walking the streets whose relatives were murdered, tortured, or disappeared at the hands of the Hennessy gang. Some of them have moved on, others have not. They don't care that the brothers are in prison. They don't care that the empire has collapsed. All they care about is settling the score. The Hennessy brothers didn't just make enemies outside their organization, they made them within their own ranks. As their paranoia grew, they began executing their own men on suspicion of betrayal, turning once loyal enforcers against them. Many of these men switched sides, aligning themselves with rival gangs or law enforcement to survive. But those who escaped now live with the knowledge that their names were once on the Hennessy kill list. For some, that means making sure the brothers never see the outside of a prison cell again. For others, it means ensuring that even prison won't protect them. Power vacuums are dangerous. When a crime boss falls, his territory, money, and influence don't just disappear. They become prizes for the next generation of criminals. But there is an unspoken rule in gangland politics. If you take over a fallen empire, you need to eliminate anyone who could one day claim it back. The Hennessy brothers may be locked away, but they are still alive. That alone makes them a threat to those who now rule Dublin's underworld. Some will argue that they are no longer a problem. Others will insist that as long as they draw breath, they remain potential leaders for a future resurgence. And in gangland law, there is only one way to erase that possibility. Prison is supposed to be a place of punishment and isolation, a place where criminals are removed from the streets and kept under lock and key. But in the world of organized crime, prison is just another battlefield. The Hennessy brothers are not serving their time in a safe, anonymous prison. They are inside a system that is infested with gangland politics, corruption, and hidden agendas. And there are plenty of people inside who want them dead. Dublin's prisons are filled with men whose lives were ruined by the Hennessys. Some were directly targeted, survived assassination attempts, or lost loved ones to their brutal rule. Others simply see them as a trophy kill, a high-profile target whose murder would instantly elevate their own status behind bars. The same criminals who rule the streets also control the prisons. The Kinahan Cartel, the West Dublin syndicates, and smaller emerging groups all have influence behind bars. If any of them decide that the Hennessy brothers need to be eliminated, the order can be given, and it won't take long before a weapon finds its way into the right hands. Not every threat comes from inmates. Corrupt prison officers who have long been known to smuggle in drugs, phones, and weapons for the right price could easily be used as tools in a gangland hit. A guard who looks the other way, who unlocks the wrong door, who ensures the cameras malfunction at just the right moment. These are the small details that make the difference between survival and execution behind bars. If they survive, if they manage to outlast the vendettas, the assassination attempts, and the years behind bars, the Hennessy brothers will eventually face the biggest question of their lives. Do they try to reclaim what was lost? Many gangsters never get that choice. They are either killed before release or locked away indefinitely. But if the brothers serve their time and make it out, they will be returning to a city that has moved on without them. The streets they once ruled will belong to new names, new crime bosses, new rivalries. Their father's empire will be a distant memory, their power erased from Dublin's gangland history. Could they rebuild? Could they take back what was once theirs? Or will they be met not with open arms, but with open graves? The Hennessy brothers are not the first crime lords to fall, and they will not be the last. Their story is just another chapter in Dublin's never-ending war for control, a cycle of violence, betrayal, and revenge that has shaped the city for generations. Their legacy, that depends on who writes the next chapter. Because in gangland Dublin, no one stays at the top forever. Dublin, 1986. A surveillance operation closes in on a quiet neighborhood. Garda, Irish police, burst into an apartment in Clontarf to find heroin packets scattered on a table, one of the largest heroin seizures in Irish history at that time. The man arrested is Kinahan, a well-dressed 29-year-old Dubliner. This moment, a massive $117,000 haul of heroin, marks the rise of a drug kingpin who will later be dubbed the Dapper Don. It's the beginning of a criminal empire that will reign over Ireland's underworld for decades. But Kinahan's story starts years before that bust. Born in 1957 to a stable family, his father managed a dairy farm. Christy didn't come from destitution. In fact, unlike many gangland figures, he was relatively well-educated and even drove a taxi in his early years. Yet the young father of two hungered for more than an honest living could provide. By the late 1970s, he had ventured into petty crime, burglary, car theft, forgery, chalking up his first convictions before age 20. This ordinary Dublin lad was slowly metamorphosing into something else, a clever, ambitious criminal with his eyes on bigger prizes. As Dublin's inner city struggled with poverty and drugs in the 1980s, heroin became an epidemic. By the mid-1980s, he had quietly become one of Ireland's major heroin suppliers. networking with suppliers and outsmarting rivals. The 1986 Clontarf seizure, at the time a record haul, put him behind bars for 6 years, but it also cemented his underworld reputation. Media would later nickname him the Dapper Don, likening him to New York's infamous John Gotti for his suave appearance and ability to evade serious convictions. He was no street thug. Christy Kinahan was calculating, polished, and patient. Kinahan served his prison term in the late 1980s, but incarceration did little to slow his ascent. In some ways, it sharpened it. Behind bars, Christy capitalized on his time. He earned 2 degrees and even learned to speak Spanish and Russian. Fellow inmates saw a quiet man immersed in books, not realizing he was preparing for a new era of international crime. By the time he refused early release in 2001 just to finish a degree, Kinahan had transformed himself into a multilingual, educated crime strategist. Not the typical gang boss at all, as Irish papers later noted. His education would prove invaluable for what came next. The 1990s brought the Celtic Tiger, an economic boom in Ireland, and with newfound wealth came surging demand for drugs. Cocaine began flooding Dublin's party scene, and various gangs fought deadly turf wars for control of this lucrative trade. While Kinahan's early focus had been heroin, he had the foresight to pivot. After a brush with the law in 1993 over a cache of stolen checks, for which he fled Ireland while on bail, Christy lay low. In 1997, he was dramatically arrested at his own father's funeral in Dublin, an outstanding warrant finally catching up with him. He was jailed again, this time for 4 years on the check fraud charges. This might have been the end for some criminals, but for Christy it was an opportunity. In prison, he refined his plans, emerging in the early 2000s with a grander vision: to build an international drug pipeline beyond the reach of Irish authorities. To understand the Kinahan cartel's rise, one must understand the fallout from a single event: the 1996 murder of journalist Veronica Guerin. Guerin's assassination by drug traffickers shocked Ireland and led to the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, a unit dedicated to seizing criminals' wealth. Under intense heat from CAB, many Irish kingpins fled abroad to keep their fortunes. Christy Kinahan was among them. Sensing that staying in Dublin was now too risky, he upped sticks around the year 2000 and relocated his operations to the sun-soaked haven of Spain's Costa del Sol. He and other gang leaders set up shop in places like Marbella and Amsterdam, where they could run their businesses from afar. This exile was strategic. In Spain, Kinahan was out of cabby's reach and off the Irish tabloids' front pages. And crucially, in those early years abroad, he kept violence to a minimum, a calculated move to avoid drawing attention from Spanish law enforcement. Through the late 1990s and 2000s, Christy Kinahan quietly consolidated power. While gangland feuds raged on Dublin streets, from the lethal Westies gang in West Dublin to the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, Kinahan stayed in the shadows, supplying many sides with drugs. Rival Irish gangs were killing each other in record numbers. Some years saw over 20 gangland murders, but Kinahan's crew was different. They became the wholesale suppliers, the shadowy brokers. By the mid-2000s, most of Ireland's drug traffickers were effectively working for the Kinahan cartel, whether they knew it or not, distributing ported cocaine and cannabis and kicking up profits to the big boss abroad. One Irish assistant police commissioner would later describe Christie's growing network as a huge crime conglomerate that had reached an unprecedented size and power in the Irish underworld. Christie embedded himself on the Costa del Sol, living in a luxe villa in Estepona worth millions. Fluent in Spanish, he blended into the expat high life. He forged ties with Spanish smugglers, North African hashish suppliers, and even established routes for Colombian and Mexican cartels, and the Russian mafia to push drugs into Europe. If cocaine was the gold of the new century, Kinahan positioned himself as one of its chief European prospectors. Ireland was a key market, but not the only one. The Kinahan reach extended to the UK and mainland Europe by the late 2000s. While Christie managed logistics abroad, trusted lieutenants, some of them childhood friends from Dublin, handled distribution and kept order back home. Violence was used sparingly and strategically. In these years, Christie's name rarely made headlines. He was the invisible hand moving multi-million euro shipments of cocaine and cannabis, while other gangs took the heat. By 2010, law enforcement across Europe had begun to grasp the enormity of Christy Kinahan's enterprise. That year, Operation Shovel was launched, a massive international crackdown on the Kinahan cartel. In May 2010, coordinated raids in Spain, Ireland, and the UK nabbed over 30 suspects, including Christy himself. At long last, it seemed the elusive Dapper Don was cornered. Spanish police hauled Kinahan in, and newspapers splashed stories of an Irish godfather taken down on the Costa del Sol. But the victory was short-lived. To the amazement of many, no significant charges stuck. Christy spent only a few months behind bars in Spain before walking free due to lack of evidence. Operation Shovel had rattled the cartel, but ultimately failed to land a knockout blow. Christy Kinahan returned to his villa and his business as usual, likely more cautious but also more confident that his low-key, sophisticated model could withstand even international scrutiny. By the end of the 2000s, the Kinahan cartel had risen from Dublin streets to become a global juggernaut. Christy Dapper Don Kinahan, once a small-time burglar, was now, according to Irish authorities, the head of the most powerful organised crime group Ireland had ever seen. His organisation sat atop an estimated $1 billion empire built on drugs, fear and corruption. With a foothold in Ireland, the UK, Spain and beyond, the stage was set for the next chapter, the expansion under the next generation of Kinahan, and the inevitable challenges to their throne. It's the late 2000s on Spain's Costa del Sol, luxury yachts bob in Marbella's marina, and high rollers sip champagne at beachfront clubs. Behind the glitz, Christy Kinahan's cartel is thriving in the shadows. Having survived Operation Shovel, the Kinahans now supercharge their global expansion. This era will see the cartel morph into a transnational drug and arms powerhouse, with alliances spanning continents, and Christie's eldest son, Daniel Kinahan, stepping forward as the new face of the empire. By the early 2010s, Daniel Kinahan was taking over day-to-day operations of the family business. Groomed by Christie, Daniel had learned the trade young and inherited his father's smarts and ambition. He was nothing if not bold, and he had a passion that would define this chapter of expansion: boxing. But before the boxing rings and Las Vegas fights, Daniel cut his teeth in the cartel's core business: drugs, guns, and money. Under Christie's guidance, he helped strengthen partnerships with other underworld titans. The Kinahan cartel became a key player in what Europol later called a European super cartel, a consortium of the biggest drug lords cooperating to dominate the cocaine trade. Kinahan emissaries struck deals with South American suppliers, including allegedly El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. They linked up with Italy's Camorra and Ndrangheta, British crime families, Dutch kingpins, Moroccan hashish smugglers, even paramilitary groups like Hezbollah, anyone who could help move product or launder money. This was organized crime on a global scale. Cocaine from Colombia and Venezuela, cannabis resin from North Africa, precursors from Asia, all found their way into Kinahan pipelines, snaking through ports in Spain, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and beyond. With drug profits soaring, the cartel diversified into arms trafficking. Guns were the lifeblood of gangland power, and the Kinahans ensured their foot soldiers and their allies were well supplied. They sourced AK-47s, submachine guns, pistols, and grenades from conflict zones and black markets, smuggling arms alongside drug shipments. In one UK case, a Kinahan lieutenant named Thomas Bomber Kavanagh stockpiled a cache of 11 deadly firearms, including assault rifles, as part of a plot to curry favor with authorities, a scheme that ultimately failed, landing him additional prison time. The cartel's gun running wasn't just for profit. It fortified their influence among other gangs by acting as an armorer and made sure they could eliminate rivals or traitors decisively. Europol reports later linked the Kinahan group to murders in at least 4 countries, illustrating how violence was a tool that extended far beyond Ireland. As the drug money poured in, Christie and Daniel expertly laundered the illicit fortune. They invested in property, villas in Spain, Dubai high-rises, and set up front companies across the world. In Dubai, where the Kinahan presence was growing, Daniel and his brother even established companies trading in food, clothing, and consulting, often with local partners to gain legitimacy. Money moved through offshore accounts and cash couriers. Some funds may have gone through the Hawala system in the Middle East, informal value transfer networks that leave little trace. The goal was to turn dirty cash into ostensibly legitimate assets. By the mid-2010s, the Kinahans had entrenched themselves in the United Arab Emirates, particularly Dubai, which offered a luxurious sanctuary with no extradition treaties covering their crimes. Cartel money was also funneled into businesses in Africa and Asia, truly a global laundry cycle for their euros. Despite this sprawling criminal enterprise, Daniel Kinahan sought something more: respectability and public influence. Boxing was his vehicle. In 2012, Daniel co-founded a boxing management company in Marbella, originally known as MGM, Macklin's Gym Marbella, and later rebranded as MTK Global. This wasn't a vanity project, it was a shrewd move to intertwine the Kinahan empire with a legitimate sport. MTK Global quickly signed dozens of fighters, including world champions. Daniel, who had a genuine love for boxing, became an advisor to fighters and began rubbing shoulders with the sport's elite. By the late 2010s, Daniel Kinahan was a power broker in boxing, arranging high-profile fights and managing big names. He was photographed with heavyweight champion Tyson Fury and veteran promoter Bob Arum, and he courted the likes of UFC star Conor McGregor, even if that feud was more tabloid fodder than serious beef. For a while, it seemed Daniel had pulled off an incredible double life. As one crime analyst noted, by 2020 he had become one of the most influential figures in the boxing sport, all while Irish courts identified him as a key cocaine and firearms trafficker behind the scenes. This strategy of mingling with the legitimate world paid dividends. Daniel cultivated an image as a businessman and fight organizer, which gave him political connections and a sheen of credibility. It also served the cartel. Boxing events provided cover for meetings with other criminals, and maybe even a route to launder money via event revenues and fighter management fees. At one point, the Kinahans were so emboldened that in February 2016, they hosted a lavish Clash of the Clans boxing event at Dublin's Regency Hotel, with Daniel present, a decision that would soon have bloody consequences, to be continued in Part 3. But up until that fateful event, the Kinahan name was not widely known to the public outside of crime reporters. Daniel largely kept to the shadows, often described only as a MTK advisor, while MTK Global's public heads insisted he had officially stepped away from the company in 2017. Behind closed doors, though, his influence was unmistakable. In 2020, WBC President Mauricio Sulaiman bizarrely praised Daniel Kinahan for improving boxers' lives, a sign of how deeply Daniel had woven himself into the fabric of the sport. And when Tyson Fury thanked Dan for securing a major fight deal in a video message, it sparked outrage in Ireland that a crime boss was being openly celebrated in sports media. Even as Daniel pushed the Kinahan brand into new arenas, the core business of the cartel kept booming. Europol and police agencies were seeing record cocaine shipments hitting Europe year after year. By now, the Kinahans were known as pivotal players in importing these drugs, not necessarily owning every shipment, but acting as key brokers and facilitators. One international investigation revealed the sheer scale: 3 tons of cocaine, 700 kilos of cannabis resin, and even a custom-built narco submarine seized in Spain were all linked to a Kinahan-driven network. The cartel, working with other groups, could summon literally shiploads of cocaine from Latin America. In Ireland, police noted an insatiable appetite for cocaine that the Kinahans and others were feeding. The gang's wealth and reach had become so vast that by the mid-2010s, authorities dubbed them a transnational criminal organization, an Irish mob gone global. However, with great power came great enemies. The Kinahan cartel's expansion wasn't unchallenged. Other crime families envied or resented their dominance. Chief among them was the Dublin-based Hutch gang, led by veteran thief Jerry the Monk Hutch. For years, the Kinahans and Hutches coexisted in an uneasy peace. Rumor has it they even collaborated on certain heists and shared profits in the past. But tensions simmered. Daniel and his brother built their own crew of loyalists in Dublin, while the Hutch family had its own criminal interests. The Kinahans had also made internal enemies. Occasionally, a trusted associate fell out of favor, and Daniel, less diplomatic than his father, was not one to forgive a perceived betrayal. By 2014-2015, whispers in the underworld hinted at a looming storm between the Kinahans and Hutch factions. The spark would come from within. Gary Hutch, Jerry Hutch's nephew, had been an ally of the Kinahans, working with them on the Costa del Sol. But something went sour. Reports vary, but Garda sources later said the Kinahans grew suspicious that Gary Hutch was skimming money or even acting as a police informant, a claim believed to be false. Worse, they thought Gary plotted to assassinate a Kinahan lieutenant in a dispute. Daniel Kinahan's response was deadly. A hit was ordered on Gary. An attempt on Gary's life failed in 2014, leading to frantic negotiations between the Kinahan and Hutch families. In a remarkable deal, the Hutch side paid a large six-figure sum, hush money, to the Kinahans to spare Gary's life, and Gary agreed to leave the drug trade. For a time, it appeared the issue was resolved. Gary returned to Spain, thinking the slate was clean. But the deal was a trap. On the morning of September 24, 2015, as Gary Hutch exercised by a swimming pool in Miraflores, Marbella, a gunman chased him down and shot him dead. The Kinahan cartel had betrayed the peace agreement and murdered the 34-year-old Gary in cold blood. It was a brazen betrayal that would light the fuse on a war. By late 2015, word of Gary Hutch's execution, essentially at Daniel Kinahan's behest, reverberated through Dublin's underworld. Jerry Monk Hutch was reportedly devastated and furious at his nephew's slaying. Quiet, calculating Jerry began plotting revenge from the shadows. The stage was set for a deadly feud that would explode onto international headlines and ultimately threaten the very existence of the Kinahan Empire. February 5, 2016, Regency Hotel, Dublin. It's mid-afternoon at a boxing weigh-in event for an MTK-promoted fight. The lobby is crowded with fans, families, and fighters. Among the crowd is Daniel Kinahan, attending the event he helped organize, surrounded by his associates. Suddenly, a man disguised as a woman in a wig pulls an AK-47 from a handbag, while across the room, gunmen outfitted in fake police tactical gear storm in with rifles. Pandemonium erupts. People dive for cover as gunfire echoes through the hotel's halls. The target is clear, the Kinahan contingent. When the chaos subsides, Daniel Kinahan is nowhere to be found. He narrowly escapes unharmed in the melee. But one of his close associates, David Byrne, lies dead on the marble floor. Byrne, a 34-year-old Kinahan lieutenant, was riddled with bullets in front of dozens of witnesses. The Regency Hotel attack was like a scene from a movie. But it was brutally real, a retaliation by Hutch-aligned hitmen for the murder of Gary Hutch. It was the opening salvo in what became Ireland's bloodiest gangland feud. And for the Kinahan cartel, it marked the beginning of their downfall. The Hutch-Kinahan feud that erupted in 2016 would leave a trail of bodies and attract unprecedented law enforcement attention. Just 72 hours after the Regency attack, the Kinahan side struck back. On February 8, 2016, Eddie Hutch Sr., Jerry Hutch's older brother, was gunned down at his home in Dublin's north inner city. He was unarmed, an easy target. Assassins pumped bullets into him in retaliation for David Byrne's death. Over the next weeks and months, a tit-for-tat cycle of murder gripped Dublin. The Kinahan hit teams, often young men on mopeds or stolen cars, faces masked, roamed the streets, hunting anyone connected to the Hutches. They killed Noel King-Size Duggan, a longtime friend of Jerry Hutch, in March 2016, as he sat in his car. In April, they shot dead Martin O'Rourke, a young man mistakenly identified as a Hutch associate, in broad daylight, an innocent victim caught in the carnage. Michael Barr, who had unknowingly helped the Regency hit squad, was executed at a pub in April 2016. In May, Gareth Hutch, Jerry's nephew, was murdered in his apartment parking lot as he buckled his child into a car seat. By the end of 2016, at least 11 men lay dead in this feud, most of them shot in the head on Dublin's streets. The once shadowy Kinahan cartel was now front-page news daily, its violence exposed for all to see. The sheer brazenness of the Kinahans during the feud stunned Ireland. It was as if Daniel Kinahan and his cohorts were trying to send a message. or perhaps scrambling to quash the Hutch threat through terror. But each killing only steeled Jerry Hutch's resolve for revenge. He and his network struck back where they could, though more of the bloodshed was Kinahan on Hutch. By 2017, the toll had climbed. 18 lives would be lost to the feud by 2021. The Irish public, watching this mob war play out, grew both fearful and angry. And the Garda, who had long faced criticism for not doing enough against big gangsters, launched an unprecedented crackdown. Specialized task forces were set up, armed officers patrolled vulnerable neighborhoods, and the government poured resources into stopping the cycle. For the Kinahans, this intense heat was something they had largely avoided when they operated from abroad quietly. Now they were labeled Ireland's public enemy, such a one. International authorities also started closing in. The Kinahan-Hutch feud had spillover outside Ireland. Gary Hutch was killed in Spain. A Kinahan hit team planned to kill Hutch family members on the Costa del Sol. Even Spain's Guardia Civil and Interpol were drawn into the case, sharing intel with the Irish. The Hutch side wasn't innocent either. In 2018, Hutch associates in Spain were caught with a hit list targeting Kinahan leaders, a plot foiled by Spanish police. The European authorities, now fully aware of the Kinahan presence in their backyard, began cooperating in ways never seen before. This narco-terror on EU soil simply could not be ignored. Meanwhile, key operatives of the Kinahan cartel started falling. In August 2017, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, effectively the Kinahan's UK boss, was arrested after NCA agents found 23 kilos of cocaine and 8 guns linked to his crew. He was later sentenced to 21 years in a British prison for drug trafficking, a major blow to the cartel's UK branch. Other trusted lieutenants met grim fates. In September 2018, hitman Freddie Thompson was convicted in Dublin of a feud-related murder and sent to prison for life. Irish and Spanish police also targeted the cartel's moneymen. They raided properties, seizing luxury cars, cash and ledgers. The noose was tightening around the Kinahan organization. However, the leadership, Christie, Daniel and Christie Jr., remained elusive, sheltered abroad. By 2017, all 3 Kinahans were believed to be in Dubai, enjoying the high life in a city that, at the time, offered them a safe harbor. Daniel continued to dabble in boxing from afar and reportedly held meetings with other cartel figures in the UAE. It seemed like the Kinahans might weather even this storm by lying low overseas. That turned out to be wishful thinking. As the feud raged, pressure built for a coordinated international response. In April 2022, that response came. In a dramatic press conference in Dublin on April 12, 2022, flanked by Irish police and Europol officials, the US ambassador to Ireland, Claire Cronin, announced US sanctions against the Kinahan cartel and something even more staggering: a $5 million bounty on each of the 3 Kinahan leaders. The Kinahans were now formally designated by the US as a significant transnational criminal organization, their bank accounts frozen, their names blacklisted worldwide. Ambassador Cronin didn't mince words. The reward was for information leading to the financial destruction of the Kinahan organized crime group, or the arrest and conviction of Christie, Daniel, or Christopher Jr. It was unprecedented for the US government to target an Irish gang, a sign of just how big and international the Kinahans had become and how serious the threat was perceived. In the wake of the sanctions, the fallout was immediate. Dubai, under heavy diplomatic pressure, reportedly froze assets and bank accounts tied to the Kinahans. Their business partners scampered away. Within days, Daniel Kinahan's pride and joy, MTK Global, ceased operations entirely, citing unprecedented scrutiny and inability to continue when its founder was sanctioned. Fighters were left managerless, gyms shut down. The Kinahan name was now poison in any legitimate circle. Tyson Fury and other boxers hastily distanced themselves from Daniel, with public warnings from law enforcement that anyone who dealt with Kinahan was effectively consorting with criminals. The message from the top was clear: no more impunity. These moves dealt a hammer blow to the cartel's finances and freedom of movement. Christie Kinahan Sr., who was about 65 by then, and his 2 sons suddenly found themselves hunted men. The US, Irish, British, and EU authorities had formed a multi-country task force laser-focused on dismantling the Kinahan enterprise. As one Irish Assistant Commissioner put it in 2023, the Kinahan cartel has been substantially degraded by successive operations by Irish, British, Spanish, and US authorities. Years of investigations were now bearing fruit. Over $2 million in cash was seized in Ireland in various raids. Properties worth far more were confiscated or frozen. Even the Kinahan's legendary ability to hide money was meeting its match as financial documents and encrypted phone messages from networks like EncroChat were intercepted. EncroChat, an encrypted phone system favored by criminals, had been secretly compromised by European police in 2020, yielding a treasure trove of evidence. Among the intercepted chats were communications of Kinahan operatives coordinating drug shipments and hits. This intel directly led to high-profile arrests. In 2023, Liam Byrne, one of Daniel's most trusted men and the head of the Kinahan faction in Ireland, Josh UK, was lured out of Dubai and arrested in Spain while dining with family. Byrne, whose own brother David was the one killed at the Regency, was wanted for weapons trafficking. The UK's NCA had evidence, thanks to EncroChat, that Byrne and an associate were sourcing pistols and submachine guns for the cartel. Irish police hailed Byrne's capture as a particularly significant development in the effort to dismantle the Kinahan gang. Alongside him, a younger Kinahan associate, Jack Kavanagh, no relation to Thomas Kavanagh, coincidentally, was nabbed in a Dubai airport transit, caught trying to slip away to Turkey. One by one, the dominoes were falling. Law enforcement on multiple continents were now in daily cooperation. A senior Garda officer in 2023 noted that agencies from the US to Colombia to the UAE were sharing intel like never before. Relationships we never had before. Now we can pick up the phone anytime, day or night, he said of the new United Front. The Garda even expanded liaison posts to Dubai and Colombia, embedding officers to coordinate the hunt. The Kinahans, who once exploited international gaps, found no safe haven. Christy Kinahan was reportedly forced to flee his luxury Dubai base and move frequently. There were sightings of him in places like Zimbabwe and Oman, looking for refuge, but nowhere is truly safe with a $5 million tag on one's head and the combined might of Western law enforcement in pursuit. By 2025, the mighty Kinahan cartel is a shell of its former self. Assistant Commissioner Justin Kelly stated the gang is no longer the dominant force it once was, and has been largely degraded by relentless operations. Their drug routes and contacts still exist, but many have been taken over by others or disrupted. Crucially, the Kinahan's ability to orchestrate violence has been blunted. Their hitmen are dead or jailed, their bankrolls under siege. We have made it difficult for the Kinahan leaders to fund or organize any hit teams again, Kelly explained, noting that assassinations require big money and logistics that the cartel can no longer easily muster. Indeed, the once unending feud with the Hutches finally petered out, as the Kinahan side could not sustain the campaign of murder under intense police pressure. In a twist of fate, Gerry Hutch was put on trial in 2022 for the Regency Hotel killing of David Byrne. But in 2023, he was acquitted due to lack of evidence, walking free from court while the Kinahans remained in hiding. The Irish police, however, have not forgotten the Kinahans' many crimes and vow to pursue them to the end. We will continue until the cartel is dismantled, Commissioner Drew Harris has pledged. Today, Christy Kinahan, now in his late 60s, and his sons Daniel, mid-40s, and Christopher Jr. remain fugitives, believed to be laying low in the Middle East. The US State Department's $5 million rewards still stand, and over 600 associates and suspected collaborators have been barred from entering the United States as part of the crackdown, a testament to how far the US is willing to go to isolate them. The Kinahan family's empire, once a well-oiled machine pumping drugs across Europe, is fractured. Many of their closest allies are imprisoned, from Irish gunmen to British smugglers, thanks to joint investigations. Internationally, their old partners in crime have largely cut ties to avoid the spotlight now shining on the super cartel. But the story isn't over until it's truly over. The Kinahans have proven resourceful in the past, surviving arrests, betrayals, even gangland wars. Irish authorities caution that while severely weakened, it would be naive to think they're out of business entirely. Still, the momentum is against the Kinahans now. Fortune no longer favors the Dapper Don. The man who once strode freely in Marbella and Dubai now has to look over his shoulder at every turn. From humble Dublin origins to a global crime empire, the Kinahan cartel rode a wave of greed, violence, and audacity to the very top, only to find law enforcement and vengeful rivals waiting there to knock them down. In the end, the Kinahan saga is a cautionary tale, a story of power and hubris, of a criminal dynasty that rose from the streets to build a narco superpower. They left in their wake countless lives ruined by drugs, a trail of bodies from Dublin to Spain, and a legacy that authorities are hell-bent on erasing. As of this narration, the net continues to close. It may take time. As one detective said, dismantling the Kinahan cartel will take a lot of time and painstaking work, but the writing is on the wall. The fall of the Kinahan cartel is underway, piece by piece, and justice, slowly but surely, is catching up with the Dapper Don and his sons.